The tension in Eastern Europe has been steadily rising since the start of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict in 2014, but most of the West's involvement leading up to this point has consisted of table talks. However, following the 2022 invasion, this all began to change. The US and EU started sending exorbitant amounts of money and resources to aid in the growing crisis. Putin began making nuclear threats, and now we find ourselves involved in the largest attack on a European country since World War II. Now, even the more traditionally passive countries are starting to discuss how this should be handled. On March 22, 2023, neutral states like Sweden joined NATO. Conscription has been reintroduced into the political discussion as well. With no signs of Russian surrender, some of the bigger players on the continent are starting to stand up. Just recently, France has made efforts to throw their hat into the ring. Having a long and complicated history with Russia, the increasing involvement of the French has left many curious as to how this will unfold in the coming years. Before we get into President Emmanuel Macron's recent public statement and why it's left its NATO allies speechless, let's look at France itself. If the country was to get more involved in the Ukraine war, what would Russia have to contend with? The military history of France is one that can be traced back 2,000 years, and for most of that time, it was considered one of the greatest in the world. However, a series of losses after 1815, such as the Franco-Prussian War, started to harm their reputation significantly. In World War I, the French started to earn back some respect after managing to hold the Western Front against the Central Powers and their allies. With more than 1.3 million military fatalities and more than 4.6 million wounded, France suffered the second highest Allied losses after Russia. However, this progress would be crushed by the Third Reich, which had adopted an effective combined arms tactic that the country was ill-prepared to handle. After the defeat, Vichy France cooperated with the Axis powers until 1944. Charles de Gaulle encouraged the French people to join the Allied armies, while the French Vichy forces participated in direct action against the same Allied forces. Although they were eventually liberated, the fall of the Third Republic made it clear that France was failing to modernize as quickly as the rest of the developing world, and the pain was far from over. Decolonization was another major hit for the French, starting with the First Indochina War, where troops were forced to withdraw from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. By 1960, France had lost its direct military influence over all of its former colonies in Africa and Indochina. Nonetheless, several colonies in the Pacific, Caribbean, Indian Oceans, and South America remain French territory to this day, and France kept a form of indirect political influence in Africa, colloquially known as the France-Afrique. Seeing the writing on the wall, French leadership knew that they had to act quickly. The newly formed French government headed by Charles de Gaulle oversaw the development of French atomic weapons and promoted a foreign policy independent of U.S. influence. Also, in an effort to focus on domestic repairs, the country was withdrawn from NATO military command in 1966, but remained part of the alliance. In the following years, France sought to harden its military, and the mission has been seen as an overall success. In the later 20th century, they made the moves to fix their recent military reputation and prove themselves on the world stage. We saw this with their activity during the Gulf War, during which France sent 18,000 troops, 60 combat aircraft, 120 helicopters, and 40 tanks to help the coalition. Mission Heracles in the war in Afghanistan, along with recent interventions in Africa, also helped fix the military power standing on the global stage. Stepping into the 21st century, France has recovered at a steady pace, strengthening relations with former enemies like Germany, along with participating in a number of peacekeeping missions that have been applauded by its close allies. Today, France has a rather formidable army, with 118,600 personnel. They continue to advocate for quality over quantity, and this policy seems to serve them well in the realm of geopolitics. On the surface, there's nothing to say but positive things regarding the French revival, but plenty of analysts are quick to point out that upon further inspection, it's a pretty mixed bag. Even before its return to NATO military command, France was on its way to restoring its position as a Western monolith. As one of the influential nuclear powers alongside the UK, the US, Russia, and China, France is ensuring the maintenance of its deterrent force and its adaptation to new strategic realities, taking into account the European dimension of its defense. That said, it's also played a big role in recent years as an advocate for arms control and nuclear disarmament, a fine line to tread considering their personal arsenal. Additionally, in 2004, it contributed a total of 84.35 million euros to the UN's regular budget and 107.57 million euros to the UN's system-specialized agencies. Presently, France prides itself as an armed mediator, cooperating with more militant countries like the United States while attempting to stand in solidarity with controversial neighbors. They do this by providing aid to poorer nations. For example, in 2003, they devoted 6.4 billion euros to official development assistance. This sum represents 0.41% of the French GDP. In contrast to its size, these facts indicate that France's cultural influence is among the strongest globally. However, this diverted attention has recently been criticized, as the nation has been suffering from serious instability within its own borders. Street protests have repeatedly paralyzed the country, and most recently riots erupted after the killing of a young man by the police. In just 4 days, the levels of violence surpassed those of the weeks-long banlieue riots of 2005. One of the strengths that has separated France from other Western countries is that it remains mostly unencumbered by opposition in parliament. Even with the protests and the riots, the state somehow managed to push legislation that wouldn't pass in the first phase in a nation like the UK. By focusing mainly on affairs beyond the mainland, President Macron has been able to meet bipartisan objectives. But now it appears that the chickens have finally come home to roost. There's plenty of footage showing rising public unrest, specifically among the country's rural communities. Spanish wine trucks are being stopped by civilians, and trucks drive into the streets blasting manure onto government buildings. In response to recent events, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki posted a tweet that contrasted a France on fire with a Poland at peace, with the strong suggestion that it all came down to immigration. Although there are obvious political motives behind the Polish accusation, one can't deny that the fire grows with little being done to put it out. France currently hosts some 700,000 refugees and asylum seekers, and that makes it the third largest host country in the European Union. This is a noble goal, but rapid growth, especially with a slow decline in national identity, has been a costly sacrifice for the rest of its citizenry. From an outside perspective, France appears to be in a relative state of denial, looking to solve the world's problems while pretending that they have none of their own. As the conflict with Russia, a country that France enigmatically supported in the past, grows to unprecedented levels, there appears to be no sign of Macron and his administration changing course. In order to fully understand Macron's recent stance on the Russo-Ukrainian war, we need to look at the most recent developments occurring between the two Eastern European countries. For the last few months, the Russian position seemed to be stagnant, and their hold on Crimea was slipping away. Successful Ukrainian drone strikes in the north, in conjunction with naval struggles in the Black Sea, indicated that a Russian loss was on the horizon. However, the offensive has become more complex as Putin made unpredictable moves to avoid a humiliating retreat. For a moment, it looked like Western assistance breathed new life into Ukrainian resistance. Even so, power outages are almost a daily occurrence across most of Ukraine. Infrastructure has been devastated by the relentless pounding of mortar and rockets. The economy, by most metrics, Europe's weakest before the war, has been left in tatters. With 3 times the population and a gargantuan military budget, Putin's long-game tactics are starting to bear fruit. Additionally, some countries like Moldova appear to be leaning toward cooperation with Russia. Moldova's government has stated that these are just rumors, but it's a dangerous possibility that can't be ignored. This year, Ukrainian forces have withdrawn from the eastern town of Avdiivka, in Russia's biggest victory since the fall of Bakhmut in May last year. This is a major win for Russia, as the location serves as an important industrial asset. Along with the recent acquisition, Russia has launched a devastating series of attacks on villages around southern Zaporizhia, a region Ukraine had initially dominated during a counteroffensive in 2023. Military experts say that Putin will have a difficult time making use of the newfound territory, but Ukraine can't really afford to lose the land. The reason for this is not necessarily because the loss of resources, although that is a pressing concern, but because Avdiivka would have served as a strategic gateway for the Ukrainian plan to invade Donetsk. So far, those losses have led to more than 11 million people being forcibly displaced by the war, including almost 6.3 million refugees. Many of those people have sought asylum in France. On one end, this is a troubling victory for the Russian army, but some have pointed to the fact that this event will feed into what is called the escalation paradox. In other words, by making such a large move, Putin has effectively summoned unwanted attention, which could very well encourage Western nations to send more aid. So far, the response to the invasion has resulted in a large number of sanctions, which the Kremlin has, at least so far, managed to shrug off, as their positive relations with nations like China have allowed them to achieve stability. According to February reports, members of NATO are beginning to clash against one another in an attempt to find common ground, and Putin is having a field day with the press. The ongoing crisis has apparently inspired world leaders to make a stand, with the first person to make their opinion known being President Emmanuel Macron. In response to recent events and Kremlin propaganda, 20 European leaders congregated in Paris to send a potent message to the Russian president. Macron, with bated breath, ended up stealing the show by stating, "We are convinced that the defeat of Russia is indispensable to security and stability in Europe. There are countries that are ready to send their own soldiers to Ukraine. There are countries that say never. Slovakia is among them, and there are countries that say that this proposal should be considered." These words sparked controversy all over the world, most of which was not at all positive. In the following hours, participants were quick to make it clear that they had little to no interest in sending their own people into the meat grinder. Putin did not mince words in his public response, stating that the West must realize that we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that? The Russian leader also went on to say that if Macron dared to bring troops into the Russo-Ukrainian battle, they would meet the same fate as Napoleon's Grand Army. It's a reference that, in typical Russian fashion, leaves little to the imagination. Macron's alleged call to arms is the product of a more modern model of the French message, a motto that pledges support for those unable to defend themselves. That said, the address has sparked a series of follow-up announcements from allies and other members of NATO. Starting with the US, the Western superpower has made its position classically vague. President Biden has expressed little interest in sending troops to the conflict, but has said they will continue to provide military aid to Ukraine so the troops have the weapons and ammunition they need to defend themselves. It's reminiscent of Roosevelt's Lend-Lease policy during the advent of the Second World War. How this will manifest remains unclear, but renewed interest in the war effort indicates that Ukraine will most likely receive a much-needed infusion in the coming months. A NATO official who spoke on condition of anonymity emphasized that there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine, despite the unprecedented military support from the alliance. The Italian government also weighed in on Macron's statement. The country's foreign minister went on record saying, "When we talk about sending troops, we must be very cautious because we must not make people think we are at war with Russia." Germany added to this, reinforcing its belief that no European country or NATO member state would send troops to Ukraine. One of the more interesting responses came from the UK, where a spokesperson for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak gave a rather cryptic message. They said that they had no intention of large-scale troop deployment, which suggests that they aren't completely dismissing the French sentiments. It should be noted that there were a number of leaders who openly supported Macron. One of them happened to be the foreign minister of Lithuania, who told the media outlets that the French president had their full support. Regardless of the current position most senior NATO members hold, Putin's aggressive nuclear threats have put the country in jeopardy of becoming a public enemy number one. His hopes that the West would become more distracted by conflict in other territories like Israel and Iran have since been stifled by his inability to remain composed. For those not connected to the European continent, it's easy to forget that this conflict is a mounting priority for those closest to the invasion. Macron is simply acting on what many in the region have been witnessing firsthand. Every month, thousands are fleeing the carnage and seeking asylum in these Western states, which are ill-equipped to handle the economic burden of a large-scale disaster. The magnitude of this is essentially doubled when you take into account that many of these countries relied on Eastern oil refineries to power their businesses and homes. It's quite possible that hostilities with Russia will balloon out of control if Putin continues on his quest to build a new Russian empire. The only remaining question, if Macron were to hypothetically follow through on his passive threat, has to do with the French military. More specifically, is it really capable of punching back against a battle-hardened foe like Russia? According to the US, the answer is a bit complicated. Analysts state France's problem isn't breadth of capabilities but depth. Not just limited numbers of weapons and munitions, but also crucial support services, such as electronic warfare, air defense, and airlift capacity. Put simply, it's not that France couldn't launch a proper offensive, rather they would require the full force of NATO if they wished to achieve a quick victory. Taking everything into consideration, Macron's assessment of the situation is quite logical. This is very on-brand considering how France has changed over the last 70 years. It's a country that has all but sworn to hold up the status quo by any means necessary, and they have the firepower to make it happen. Only time will tell if his statement is a prophecy for what's to come, or just another proposition destined to fall on deaf ears. Francis Brighton crashes through the doors and into the war room where a group of generals sit. He is a NATO intelligence officer and has come across something truly horrifying. The military leaders turn in their seats to look at him. "Sir, you need to see this," Francis says, holding out a manila folder containing images taken by a spy satellite. The general slowly reaches for the folder, opens it, and begins flipping through the pages. His brow furrows in concern. The general shakes his head and passes the folder to the person sitting next to him. "God save us," he whispers, as the photographs circulate around the table. Francis waits patiently in a corner of the room while each member of the NATO alliance looks at the photos he brought with him. The last general examines the images, closes the folder, and hands it back to Francis. He turns to the rest of the men in the room. "What should we do?" he asks. There's discussion about launching a counterattack. Some NATO members want to keep the status quo the way it is. Putin is clearly insane, and like any wild animal that's backed into a corner and feels threatened, he is more than willing to lash out in the most deadly way possible. Others in the room believe now is the time to act. They advocate for the deployment of more troops along the Russian border. "I'm going to say what everyone else is thinking," one of the generals states as he stands up from the table. "We need to arm the nukes currently stationed in France and Britain." An eerie silence envelops the room. Francis shifts back and forth on his heels. He's remained quiet until now. "If I may, sir," he says, "the images clearly show that Russia's moving tactical nukes from this Object S site to their naval base on the Black Sea. However, we do not know if this is just a posturing gesture or if Putin means to use them." The generals around the room grumble. They all know this could be the first step toward nuclear war. Until this point, Vladimir Putin's only threatened to use tactical nukes in his war against Ukraine. Now he actually has taken steps to put those words into action. The deployment of several tactical nukes, each with an estimated payload of 1 kiloton or 1,000 sticks of dynamite, could change the world forever. The generals continue to deliberate. "Commander Brighton," one of them says, "we need you back at your post. Keep your eyes on the Russian nukes and update us of any further movements." Francis salutes the general and runs out of the room. He sprints down the hallways of the intelligence building back to the command center. Screens flash different images. TVs play live feeds from news outlets around the world. No one knows about the very real threat that he has uncovered except for the NATO generals. Francis types vigorously on the keys of his keyboard. He glances at the picture next to his screen. It's a photo of his wife holding their newborn daughter. She smiles as if nothing could ever get in the way of their happiness. Unfortunately, Putin seems hell-bent on doing just that, by throwing Europe into a nuclear war. Francis taps back into the satellite feed that he initially spotted the tactical nukes from. He zooms in on the road leading from the Russian nuclear base to the Black Sea coast. The trucks carrying the tactical nukes have made significant progress. They're only miles away from the naval base. Hours pass. Francis periodically sends updates to the NATO generals regarding the movement of the Russian tactical nukes. Putin had promised to use them for several weeks, but many thought this was an empty threat. Now it looks like he's about to make good on what he's been saying all along. There's been little movement on the Russian naval base where the nukes were dropped off. Francis has a hunch the warheads have been mounted onto SSN-30A caliber missiles and loaded onto Russian subs, but without proof, there's very little he can do. It seems like the only way that Russia could secretly deploy the nukes and get them within range of targets in Ukraine is by submarine. Francis's eyes are exhausted from looking at computer monitors nonstop for days. Every time he blinks, it stings. The intelligence officer stands up and stretches. He walks to the break room where a fresh pot of coffee is just finished brewing. As he pours himself a cup, he watches live coverage of the battle raging on the outskirts of Kyiv. Suddenly, the camera tilts upward. For a moment, a missile can be seen screaming across the sky. It arcs down and slams into the ground near a group of Ukrainian forces. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, there's a bright flash and the feed cuts off. Francis stares wide-eyed at the static on the television. The coffee mug falls from his hands and shatters on the floor. For a moment, Francis is paralyzed with fear. It is very clear what he just witnessed. Russia launched a tactical nuke and wiped out everything in a quarter-mile radius. Francis sprints back to the control room and begins gathering as much intel as possible. He needs to figure out how much damage was done and in which direction the fallout is heading. By looking at satellite feeds, Francis can just make out the distinctive mushroom cloud rising up over the landscape. The wind seems to be blowing smoke further into Ukraine. Once again, Russia has caused a nuclear catastrophe on Ukrainian soil. Later that day, Francis gives a report to the NATO generals. It appears Russia used a 1 kiloton tactical nuke to destroy an entire Ukrainian tank battalion. Reports have been coming in across the world that countries are condemning Russia's actions. Everyone knows that if nuclear war breaks out, there will be no winners. Russia and the US alone have enough nukes to wipe humanity off the face of the planet, and that's not accounting for the nuclear warheads located in Britain and France. After the blast was confirmed to be from a tactical nuke, NATO armed several missiles at sites across Europe. They have not fired yet, but it seems that'll only be a matter of time before someone has to stand up to Vladimir Putin. Trying to reason with the homicidal maniac doesn't seem to be working. Even China, Russia's most powerful ally, has turned on them. China has a strict no first-use nuclear doctrine, which Russia has just broken. In the eyes of China, nukes should only be used to defend one's own country, not as a weapon for offensive purposes. This is how much of the world feels, and it's the reason why almost every country on the planet has turned against Vladimir Putin. But as far as Francis can tell, this doesn't seem to be deterring the leader of the Russian Federation. Russia used the tactical nuke to show just how serious they were taking NATO's constant resupplying of Ukraine with weapons and supplies. Putin also wanted to make it clear he had no problem taking things to the next level and engaging in nuclear warfare. Europe is now in an even more tenuous position. In briefings that Francis has been a part of, all options were put on the table. Many leaders believed that NATO needs to launch a nuke at Russia to show they will not just back down. The flip side of this is that Putin could escalate things further and start firing larger strategic nukes at targets across Europe. If this happens, the entire continent could be decimated by fireballs and nuclear fallout. The tactical nuke that Putin fired obliterated everything within a quarter mile, and although the radiation from the blast will travel further, it's nothing compared to the much larger nukes that both Russia and NATO have at their disposal. These bombs can be 1,000 times more powerful than the tactical nuke that Russia used, and each one could wipe out entire cities and cause millions of casualties. This is obviously what Europe is trying to avoid, but they also can't let Putin get away with unleashing a nuke on the people of Ukraine. Francis listens to the other options being suggested by the military leaders in the room. Some of the generals think that NATO should send forces into Russia and use conventional weapons to bring Putin to his knees. The counter-argument is obvious. If forces from Europe invade Russia, Putin will almost certainly launch more nukes to defend his homeland, resulting in the annihilation of much of Europe. Another option is to tighten the economic sanctions already placed on Russia. Unfortunately, these didn't seem to stop Putin the first time around, and it's unlikely they'll cause him to back down now. Economic sanctions also won't help deter Putin from using more nuclear bombs. It's determined that this could actually cause him to escalate things further as more countries turn against him. Even though China and most other countries are upset with Putin's actions, Russia still supplies a massive amount of oil and gas to the rest of the world. This includes Europe. And if Russia completely cuts off fossil fuel supplies to the EU, everyone within its borders will suffer. Utility prices across Europe have already skyrocketed to unprecedented levels as Russia continues to cut off its supply of oil, and many European families can no longer afford to heat their homes during the cold winter months. Then, one of the generals comes up with an idea so crazy, it might just work. Francis sits at his computer station staring blankly at his screen. He can't believe the decision the generals came to. He closes his eyes and rubs the bridge of his nose. "Forgive us," he whispers, and then focuses on the task at hand. Francis moves several satellites into optimal viewing positions, which will allow them to collect analytics for what is about to happen. The satellites align and begin transmitting data. They're pointed at a military base in Belarus. A digital clock has begun countdown. The generals are now in the control room with Francis so they can witness the aftermath of their choices. Belarus is not at war with Europe. The country is controlled by Alexander Lukashenko, a power-hungry dictator who allied himself closely with Putin. There's no doubt that Belarus supports Russia in its endeavors, but the Belarusian military is not actively slaughtering people in Ukraine like Russia is, nor do they have any nuclear weapons. Francis and the generals watch as the countdown reaches zero. On one of the side monitors, a video feed of a missile launching from a British battleship in the Baltic Sea is being played. The satellites track the missile as it arcs through the sky and descends upon a Belarusian military base. Unknowing soldiers carry out their daily routines. The seconds tick by. Everyone in the room holds their breath. Then, confirmation comes through that the tactical nuke launched by NATO has detonated and destroyed its target. Francis feels sick to his stomach. The men on the base had no idea what was coming or that they were even in any danger. Now they've been vaporized by a nuclear blast. One of the generals claps his hands together. "Someone get me the Kremlin on the phone." Maybe now Putin will talk, but he doesn't. The plan was to show that NATO was not afraid to use its own nuclear weapons. Military leaders knew they could not launch a nuke at Russia to demonstrate their resolve, but it was determined that by blowing up a target in Belarus, they could still send a clear message to Vladimir Putin that NATO would retaliate with nukes if necessary. There's no doubt that Alexander Lukashenko is a terrible man who's done terrible things to the people in his country, but many feel like NATO took things a step too far. Belarus was sided already with Russia and has given them support in their fight against Ukraine, but now the Eastern European country has declared war on the rest of Europe. They do not have the military forces to back up the threats they're making, but Russia's made it clear that it will stand with Belarus and aid them in their war against the other countries in Europe. NATO leaders knew this would be inevitable, but hoped their show of force would cause Putin to back down slightly. However, this plan hinged on the belief that Putin, like everyone else around the world, wouldn't want to risk all-out nuclear war. But Vladimir Putin is not a sane human being, and therefore his actions following the show of force by NATO are not rational. Both Russia's decision to use a tactical nuke in Ukraine and NATO's choice to fire their own nuclear missile at Belarus have put the continent in a very tumultuous position. Countries around the world are condemning both sides and begging for everyone to come to the table and discuss what's happening before things escalate to levels from which the world might never return. Francis never agreed with the decision to show that Europe would also use nukes if Putin didn't back down. However, his intel has proved invaluable to the generals of NATO. When Vladimir Putin sent a communication that he wanted to sit down for peace talks, everyone was ecstatic. A delegation was sent to the Ukrainian border, where NATO ambassadors would meet with top officials from Russia. Francis was asked to come along to provide the latest intel about where Russian troops were located. Hopefully, this information could be used as leverage to show Russia that they were always being closely watched. It would also serve as proof that NATO knew about key military installations, was not afraid to target them if Russia failed to cooperate. Francis is reluctant to go, but he knows it's his duty, and hopefully the intel he provides can help the two sides come to an agreement. Before he leaves his station, Francis pulls the picture of his wife and baby off the side of his screen and puts it in his pocket. Francis and the delegation of NATO diplomats head to the Ukrainian border. They land on a military airfield in Poland and are escorted to the border by NATO forces. As they cross over to Ukraine and enter the small town where the talks are supposed to take place, something seems off. The convoy comes to a stop. The delegates step out to look around. It's quiet. There's no sign of the Russian representatives. Maybe they're just running late, someone suggests. The group heads to the town hall where Russia initially agreed to begin peace talks. They enter the building. It's cold and empty. Cobwebs hang from the ceiling. It's clear no one has been here for a very long time. Something is very wrong. "I suggest we get back to the airbase," one of the soldiers says. Francis looks around. He closes his eyes and tightly grips the picture of his wife and daughter in his pocket. He should have seen this coming. He should have kept a closer eye on the movements of the Russian troops in the area. Initially, when Francis noticed that the Russian forces were pulling back, he thought it was a sign of good faith. He just presumed the Russians didn't want to seem threatening, especially during peace talks. Now he realizes how stupid that train of thought was. Just like everyone else, Francis wanted this conflict to end without nuclear war. The Russian forces were not pulling back as a sign of their willingness to engage in peace talks. They were retreating because of what was about to happen next. Suddenly, an intelligence officer stationed back at the airbase begins shouting over the comms. "Missile incoming! Get out of there!" the voice yells. A tear rolls down Francis's cheek. A moment later, there's a bright flash. A massive explosion erupts out of the nuclear warhead as it detonates, vaporizing the NATO delegation and ending the peace talks. At the same moment as the nuke on the Ukrainian border detonates, Russia launches several more tactical nukes into Kyiv. Although this will destroy most of the city and irradiate the surrounding area, the Russians need to eliminate the Ukrainian resistance once and for all to prove their dominance. They do not send troops or tanks across the border into Europe, as they had a hard enough time fighting against Ukraine and would never succeed in capturing the rest of Europe using conventional warfare. EU's leaders watch in horror as Russia launches nuke after nuke. They have not targeted any of Europe's major cities yet. Instead, their targets all seem to be Ukrainian military installations. Russia's showing the world they have escalated their wartime tactics to use tactical nukes. Regular missiles are now all but obsolete. The benefit of using these smaller nuclear weapons is that there's less destruction and fallout, but they still decimate any enemy force in the vicinity. Putin makes it known that if Europe or any NATO nations try to invade his country or launch a counterattack, he's not afraid to unleash his whole nuclear arsenal on Europe. NATO leaders scramble to decide what to do next. Do they launch their own nukes and engage in an all-out nuclear war with no winner? Or do they increase sanctions and mobilize forces to keep Russia from expanding any further into Europe? France and Germany launch ground forces and set up heavy defensive positions along the Ukrainian border. Poland asks for reinforcements as Belarusian military forces cross their border and attack any soldiers or civilians in sight as retaliation for NATO launching a nuke at their country. A major fear is that Russia will sell or gift tactical nukes to Belarus, who will then launch them against NATO forces in Europe. At this point, they could make a strong case to justify such an action. Nuclear war seems all but inevitable. For several weeks, Russia does not seem interested in an invasion of Europe. European countries and their allies struggle to figure out the best way to de-escalate the situation with Putin and his loose trigger finger. Thus far, all of the nuclear warheads fired by Russia have been around a kiloton, meaning that no strategic or megaton nukes have been launched yet. It seems like Europe continues to let Putin get away with murder, but NATO is trying its best to avoid a catastrophic war that will lead to nuclear winter. European leaders have been thrown into an unwinnable situation. They either roll over and let Vladimir Putin get away with his egregious atrocities, or they launch their own offensive and deal with the inevitable nuclear consequences. Europe has completely stopped purchasing oil, gas, and goods from Russia. This has hurt the people and the economies of the nations in the EU, but it was a necessary step. Russia's economy has all but collapsed, yet they still have a large influence over oil exports. Not only do they control where their own fossil fuels go, but they also have influence over the other OPEC countries in the Middle East. And even though China condemned the actions of Russia, they rely too heavily on their natural resources to cut ties completely. The suffering in Europe is exacerbated by the fact that every country must ramp up military production and recruitment. Without its main supply of oil and gas, there are not enough resources to go around. Europe has been moving away from fossil fuels and toward using renewable energy, but at this point, it's too little too late. Things become desperate as Germany's economy goes into a depression and the British pound becomes worthless. European nations decide it's time to fight back against the evil dictator of Russia. France and Germany launch air raids across the border. The British Navy fires cannons at Russian naval bases and blockade major ports. Infantry and armor units amass along main strategic points, and when the signal's given, cross into Russian territory. There's carnage and chaos across the continent. As Russian forces are defeated and pushed back, Putin makes the decision that everyone was afraid of but knew was coming. He fires tactical nukes at NATO forces. Nuclear bombs detonate on land and in sea. The British Navy in the Baltic is decimated. In a day, millions of lives are lost, but eventually Putin knows he will either run out of tactical nukes or soldiers, so he does the unthinkable. Warning lights flash across every surveillance center in Europe. Russia has launched hundreds of nukes from its arsenals. These are not the low-yield tactical nukes. Each one is over a megaton. When the warheads explode, they will demolish entire cities and wipe out military forces across Europe. There's no other choice but to fight back. Britain and France launch their own nukes at Moscow and other Russian targets. The rest of the world watches in horror as Europe is consumed by fireballs and covered in radiation. Most of Russia's forces are destroyed when the nukes from Europe explode on Russian soil. For the next several decades, most of Europe will be uninhabitable as the fallout spreads across the continent on shifting winds. The end of Vladimir Putin's reign comes at a cost of an irradiated European continent. It all started with a single tactical nuke launched from a Russian sub at Ukrainian forces. It's a grim outlook for the future of Europe if Putin ever does decide to use nuclear weapons. If this happens, decisions about what to do will be difficult to make. There will likely be mistakes, and many people will die as a result of Vladimir Putin's cavalier use of tactical nukes. There are no good options when it comes to nuclear warfare. This is why no one has used a nuke in combat since 1945, when the United States dropped the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The situation in Ukraine might be the closest we've been to nuclear destruction since the Cuban Missile Crisis, except in the current situation, it's not the Soviet Union and the United States who have to come to some sort of agreement, but the leaders of Europe and Vladimir Putin. Hopefully, just as the crisis in 1962 was averted, we can avoid a nuclear holocaust in the coming months. There's a new military superpower dawning on the European continent, and no, it's not France, Germany, or even Britain. Poland has decided it's done messing around, and it's arming itself to the teeth. But why is Poland apparently preparing itself for World War III? Russia's invasion of Ukraine has served as an alarm bell for a Europe that for 3 decades was content to let the United States do all its military heavy lifting, while naturally complaining endlessly about U.S. militarization. However, the explosion of war in its backyard has snapped European powers out of their comfortable post-Cold War victory naps, and suddenly the continent has remembered there's a serious military threat right next door, and America is still an ocean away. Forget the baguettes and berets, it's time to start buying guns again. But Europe can hardly be blamed for dropping the ball on their own defensive spending. After decades of being prepared to wage an apocalyptic battle for global survival, the West breathed a collective sigh of relief, and billions of dollars in military spending was repurposed to civilian projects. Armies were demobilized, budgets were slashed, and a lot of military kit was either thrown into deep storage or donated to developing countries. With the rise of extremism, European militaries focused on waging small regional conflicts with logistics handled almost entirely by the US. The next major war would be one with hugs, or simply not fought at all, as Europe tried to bring Russia into the fold by deepening trade relations with their cranky neighbor. Yet all Europe managed to do was give Russia incredible leverage over them, because Russia wasn't done fighting wars to advance its national agenda. When war broke out in Ukraine, Europe was caught with its pants down, and despite having a combined GDP many times greater than Russia, they cannot outsupply Russia inside Ukraine. Poland was quick to take note though, and overnight the country went on a dizzying shopping spree for all kinds of new military kit. Poland has good reason to want to buy absolute mountains of new tanks and other gear, and that's not an exaggeration. Had Russia's invasion of Ukraine been planned by anyone more competent, Poland could have found itself at ground zero of a new military struggle for Europe, and the major European powers could have done little if anything to help the nation. Britain has been in decline as a military power for decades now, with its military shrinking to half of its size at the end of the Cold War. As an island nation, Britain's most important capability is its ability to send expeditionary forces abroad. And yet, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the British military got the nickname the Borrowers for their tendency of bartering for pieces of kit that they were missing. Meanwhile, their navy's been in significant decline, with their ships having to be in effect mothballed so their crews can be used elsewhere. In 2021, Britain's Parliamentary Defence Committee delivered a scathing report outlining significant problems with the Royal Navy, including a critical lack of offensive capability and too few surface ships and submarines. Germany's facing its own significant issues. Maintenance problems from a lack of qualified technicians as well as spare parts has meant that German pilots aren't getting the number of hours in the cockpit they need to remain proficient. The country is also incapable of meeting NATO's rapid response requirements without cannibalizing other units, leaving it in serious risk of being incapable of fighting a protracted conflict. France is about the only European power to maintain a significant military capability. We actually have little to criticize about France, except that its expeditionary capabilities are slightly lacking, but experience gained in counter-terrorism operations in Africa is helping to rectify the problem. We're not picking on Europe unfairly, though. The simple fact is the continent has been coasting on the back of the US military for decades. The Royal Navy prioritized retiring logistics vessels as a cost-saving measure. Why? Because any conflict they foresaw fighting would involve the United States and its massive logistics capabilities. Germany retired much of its ground-based air defenses. Why? Because any war it would be involved in would have assumed air superiority largely thanks to the United States. Since the Cold War ended, Europe evolved into a power that would complement US warfighting abilities rather than be a battlefield force on its own. Given the fact that Europe's favorite historical pastime was mercilessly slaughtering each other for thousands of years, this might not have been such a bad thing. Poland has seen which way the wind's blowing, and that it cannot rely on its European allies for national defense. The US military is the most powerful in the world, but it's also half a planet away. And if history is anything to go by, and it absolutely is if you're Poland, then by the time the US Army arrives in Europe in force, Poland would already be a battleground. Perhaps no nation in the world is as cursed as Poland, which has historically served as a convenient middle ground for major European armies to batter each other to pieces. That's because the nation has basically no defensive geographical features, allowing invaders to just casually stroll right on in at their leisure. Poland is done being Europe's punching bag and is aiming to field the most capable military inside of Europe. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki spoke to the nation on the eve of its Independence Day, stating the Polish army must be so powerful that it does not have to fight due to its strength alone. Judging by the amounts of weapon orders it's been putting in, this is far more fact than wishful thinking. Poland is raising its defensive spending from 2.4% of their GDP to a whopping 5%. This is more than even the United States. It also puts other NATO partners to shame who have largely struggled to meet the bare minimum requirement set by the alliance of 2%. This is a long-term commitment too, as the country is determined to double the size of its military by 2035, from 150,000 to 300,000. Those troops are gonna need combat gear though, and Poland is buying it in spades. In exchange for sending 240 Soviet-made tanks to Ukraine, the US cut Poland a deal for 250 Abrams, a significant upgrade to its land forces, but the nation was paying very close attention to the fighting in Ukraine and has made a direct bid to Lockheed Martin to buy around 500 HIMARS units. This was an incredible order and would have made Poland as big an operator of HIMARS as the United States. Unfortunately, the US was itself procuring units to replace those sent to Ukraine and to make even more available to the country. Given that the war in Ukraine has been basically one giant commercial for Lockheed Martin, it's no surprise that other nations were already in line to buy the vaunted guided rocket artillery, even with the US wishing to beef up its own numbers. With the US in effect sold out for the foreseeable future, Poland turned to South Korea for its guided rocket artillery need, signing an order for 288 Chunmoo platforms. Similar to HIMARS, only beefier, the Chunmoo can carry twice as many rockets as HIMARS, though at the cost of mobility. With a significant standing army in the works though, Poland believes the trade-off is worth it. Its rocket artillery will have to do less hiding thanks to major investments in other areas of its military. This includes the Air Force, with Poland signing an agreement to buy 32 F-35s. but Poland shocked the world when it once more returned to South Korea for multiple military purchases, in effect sourcing almost all of its new purchases from the nation. Purchases include a fleet of 48 Fa-50s. These are meant to replace its aging fleet of MiGs and will complement its inventory of F-16s and soon F-35s. While Poland won't have a major air force anytime soon, it's well on its way to being a significant threat to Russia should it ever make the mistake of crossing into its airspace. Beefing up its traditional tube artillery, Poland is also buying 648 K9 howitzers from South Korea. This will make Poland one of, if not the biggest artillery power in Europe aside from Russia, especially when coupled with its purchase of 288 Chunmoo MLRSs. By far the highest profile item on Poland's shopping list though, and one that has really annoyed its neighbor, is the purchase of nearly 1,000 K2 main battle tanks. The K2 was originally designed by South Korea and is believed to be a highly capable modern tank. Its real capabilities are unknown though, as the tank has never seen combat and the South Korean government isn't in a hurry to make classified data public. Most observers, however, have full confidence in the K2, though Russian defense analysts are puzzled by the design decision to not have the tank launch its crew into orbit upon taking a hit from an anti-tank missile. The main concern raised by Poland's purchase power, however, is that the K2 was specifically built for a war South Korea expected to fight on its relatively hilly terrain, a far cry from the flat European plain. How the K2 will fare here is anyone's guess, and hopefully we'll never have to find out. Poland-South Korea spending spree has made the two countries absolutely chummy, and that's something that's really annoyed the rest of Europe. Home to many great tank manufacturers, Europe is frankly puzzled at Poland's decision to purchase tanks from a nation half a world away, especially when its logistics will depend on easily disrupted supply routes that literally span the planet. But the decision makes a lot of sense if South Korea plans to break into the global arms market, and if the nation builds maintenance facilities inside of Poland itself. This will secure Poland's logistics needs and open the door to the European arms market for South Korea, a deal that benefits both sides. Germany has famously been the United States' most important European ally, but now Germany's become nothing more than a logistics hub for the American military. With the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Poland has now become America's most important European ally, and the relationship was cemented by U.S. officials commenting on that fact. Perhaps unsurprising given its proximity to Russia, Poland was the loudest voice calling for Europe to aid Ukraine and threw its doors open to Ukrainian refugees. Its airfields and transport networks were immediately made available to the US and other foreign aid flowing into Ukraine. And when a Ukrainian air defense missile landed in Poland and killed several people, the nation put the blame squarely on Russia for necessitating the launch of said missile by Ukraine in the first place. Given Poland's history and tenuous strategic position in Europe, it's no surprise that it's incredibly invested in the outcome of the war in Ukraine. What is surprising, however, is the incredible speed with which the country has moved to bolster its defenses and the willingness to work with the United States to arm Ukraine. Given its position inside of Europe and the military capabilities it'll soon field, it's easy to see why Poland will soon trump the rest of the European powers as America's most important ally in the region. What remains to be seen, however, is if the nation will go through with all of its planned purchases, especially if the war in Ukraine ends sooner than expected and the Polish population grows weary of the incredible price tags of some of these weapons. Germany is one of the guarantors of European security, and yet the entire world questions if Germany's military is up to the task. Is Germany ready to fight a major conflict in Europe, and how would it perform? Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call for a complacent, pacifist Europe. After the end of the Cold War, Europe had a reason to relax. But while everyone was taking siestas and sipping espressos at their favorite bistro, Russia was plotting. When Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, Europe hardly blinked because not only had it become complacent, but it had become extremely dependent on the energy supplied by the only challenge to their own national security. Nobody was more guilty of this than Germany, who foolishly believed it could sway Moscow via trade dependence. Instead, Germany handed Putin the very reins of its economy. The second invasion of Ukraine at last woke Europe up to the fact that it still had a belligerent, much bigger neighbor on its border. By then, though, the state of many European militaries was utterly abysmal, and few major European powers were in worse shape than Germany. During the Cold War, the readiness rate of the West German military hovered around 90%. Today, that figure is anywhere between 20 to 40%, meaning that only 20 to 40% of its personnel and equipment is ready for immediate action. For years, Germany couldn't even meet its NATO commitments to the Rapid Response Force established during the Obama presidency to counter sudden Russian aggression unless it first cannibalized other units for supplies and gear. In 2018, Jorge Benitez of the Atlantic Council think tank stated, "The readiness of the German military is abysmal. For years, German leaders have known that major elements of their armed forces, such as tanks, submarines, and fighter jets, are not fully operational and can't be used for actual military missions." Despite Germany's strong economy, its military was found to be one of the weakest on the continent. Famously, President Donald Trump considered Germany a freeloader, coasting on the might of the US and the rest of NATO as guarantors of its own security. At the same time, not a single one of Germany's submarines could take to sea. Only 4 of its 128 Eurofighter were prepared for combat, and the Army's vehicles were unprepared to meet NATO combat requirements. Its troops had no body armor, no night vision equipment, and even lacked cold weather clothing. How in the world could one of Europe's economic powerhouses have a military incapable of defending even its own borders? The answer is a strong pacifist streak amongst German policymakers, but also a willingness to sacrifice on security in order to stimulate its national economy. And when you've got one of the largest concentrations of American troops outside of the US borders in your territory, you probably feel pretty secure. Hiding under America's skirts, Germany instead preferred to spend its money on everything but defense, crippling its ability to fight even a light-intensity conflict. But German society is also deeply uncomfortable with military spending, and given its history in the first half of the 20th century, it is easy to see why. In a 2018 poll, 51% of those surveyed stated that they did not want their military budget to increase, despite a pledge to NATO in 2014 to finally hit 2% of GDP spending on its own defense. 13% wanted even further cuts. Time and again, Germany tried to push through some legislature to increase military spending, but inevitably it was either slashed or failed to pass into law, with the funds instead being diverted to social welfare programs. Despite this, in 2019, Germany led NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, designed to quickly deploy to hotspots in Eastern Europe. German defense documents leaked to the public by the Die Welt newspaper showed that the German contingent of this task force only had 9 of the 44 Leopard 2 tanks it needed operational, and only 3 of the 14 Marder armored personnel carriers. The German Air Force's readiness was even worse, needing partner support to even get a fraction of its air power to the skies. The security situation is critical thanks to a resurgent Russia, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz declared an end to the decline of the German military by pledging a $104 billion increase in defense spending and to meet NATO's requirement of 2% of GDP. Yet already there are doubts that more than half of this money will actually end up being procured and spent on the military, and Germany's bold rearmament plans might be nothing but hot air. Europe's largest economy could once more end up coasting on the strength of its NATO partners, outsourcing its own defense while spending money elsewhere. For a long time, Germany's European partners were deeply uncomfortable with a military resurgence for Germany, for very obvious reasons. However, in recent years, opinion polls show that the rest of Europe is a lot more comfortable with the idea of a strong German military than in previous decades. In fact, much of the world sees it as a necessity for the stability of Western democracies, especially as Russia and China rise to challenge the world order with their own authoritarian models. Fears that NATO might fall apart, spurred on largely by the Donald Trump presidency, has even led people like France's Emmanuel Macron to push for Europe to guarantee its own security with a powerful EU military. Germany would necessarily be the centerpiece of such a military if it got its act together. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has successfully swayed the German public opinion, though, with now 63% stating that they support the plan to spend $104 billion on the military in the coming years. But Chancellor Scholz hasn't done himself or Germany any favors. His longtime refusal and constant moving of the goalposts in regards to sending Leopard 2s to Ukraine has eroded Germany's credibility, to the point that much of Europe is once more looking at the US for leadership in its own backyard. When it comes to military spending, Olaf is once more waffling, stating one day that he doesn't wish to repeat the mistakes of pre-World War I Germany in rearming itself, while the next day stating that a strong German military would encourage its NATO allies that the nation can be counted on. Scholz has done so much waffling since the invasion of Ukraine, the man practically runs his own Waffle House at this point, and it's hurting Germany's image abroad. The Polish people have developed a very low opinion of their neighbor, with Polish President Andrzej Duda stating, "The mood here is very critical. Germany's just not a credible power because it has been moving so slowly. The focus in Poland is so much about what the US and Great Britain are doing." So, is Germany ready for a third global war? No, it isn't. Readiness rates have not improved much since 2018. Though we can expect to see this improve in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the German Air Force still struggles to put planes in the air or give its pilots enough flight hours to remain qualified on their combat jets. To be prepared for a major power conflict, Germany needs to reverse course on decisions made as far back as 2008. Back then, German defense thinking gravitated around the reduction of the German military to become a light expeditionary force. This suited the nation's current needs and greeds perfectly, as it faced no credible threat at home, was so intertwined in trade with Russia that it believed Moscow wouldn't threaten their economic relationship, and at the time was only fighting low-intensity conflicts against insurgent or terror groups in the Middle East. Thus, German heavy fighting units began to be dramatically cut, with heavy combat vehicles being slashed first. Currently, Germany is unlikely to be able to field even a single heavy brigade, let alone keep it supplied during high-intensity combat ops. Currently, according to a German Ministry of Defense analysis, 71 of Germany's major combat systems have readiness rates of about 77%. This is a vast improvement, but many in NATO are casting a skeptical eye on the report, given the German military's previous problems with readiness. 11 systems had readiness ratings of under 50% though, with combat vehicles standing at 71%. Naval combat units stood at 72%, combat and transport aircraft were at 65%, support vehicles at 82%, and helicopters at an abysmal 40%. The report also found that despite improved readiness rates, the German military was struggling with modernity issues. Many of its armored vehicles were either severely aged or obsolete. Its CH-53 helicopters and P-3C patrol aircraft were in states of crisis and in dire need of replacement. Its attack helicopters were also in serious trouble and facing big modernity problems. At sea, the problem is even worse, with only 30% of the German Navy being fully operational. But the readiness figures have been cleverly manipulated, as these figures only account for equipment that the military actually has available and on hand. The numbers don't account for equipment that is either being repaired or upgraded by the manufacturer. Of 289 Leopard 2s, only 183 of them are actually available to the Army, or 63%. Germany then claims a readiness rate of 75%, which means only 137, less than half of the entire fleet, is actually ready for combat operations today. To turn things around, Germany needs to restructure its defense industry from the bottom up. Currently, German defense manufacturers work with a very small number of orders per year. Therefore, in order to avoid shutting a production line down and losing technical expertise, German arms manufacturers instead work very slowly, dragging the work on each vehicle sent for repair or upgrade out over months. Increased spending will necessarily mean more production, but even during protracted lulls, Germany needs to absorb the economic impact of keeping a set number of production and repair facilities fully staffed and prepared at all times, instead of shutting them down and consolidating to a smaller number of facilities. Changing German culture will also be necessary for Germany to repair its military. Currently, Germany is experiencing a surge in popular support for defense spending. But should the Ukrainian war end in the near future, it's unlikely the support will continue. When it comes to defense, modern Germans are notoriously short-sighted. For one, there's no strong cultural support for the military in Germany, and the military must compete with civilian employers to attract soldiers. Given that Germany only ended conscription in 2011 and is having great difficulty implementing an all-volunteer force, these do not look like problems that Germany is set to solve anytime soon. So how would Germany fight a major global conflict in its backyard? Simply put, not very well. One must not underestimate German industry and its historical power to pump out weapons at high intensity, but modern warfare moves incredibly quickly and consumes resources at a truly astonishing rate. Even the United States found itself seriously reconsidering the readiness of both its military and military-industrial capacity after the first few months of fighting in Ukraine. That's why it's important for Germany to build a strong military and military-industrial complex today. For now, the best that Germany could do is provide logistical support and perhaps, at best, a heavy combat brigade. Germany would rely on the US and the rest of NATO partners for all of the heavy lifting. Its naval forces, with a readiness rate hovering around 30%, would be essentially useless on their own, and instead what ships could actually sail would find themselves thrown into American or European formations under the command of foreign admirals. Likewise, its air force would be relegated to fulfilling niche obligations, incapable of sustaining high-tempo combat ops on the front line. For the sake of European security and the credibility of Western democracies, Germany must reverse course now. The time of coasting on the defense capabilities of others is over. Switzerland prides itself on being neutral, but how neutral is it really? During World War II, Switzerland didn't outwardly pick a side. This allowed both Jewish and Nazi money to be kept in their vaults. Switzerland has refused to join the European Union since its conception in 1993, but 10 years later it joined the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member. So what is actually going on with Switzerland? Why is the country willing to join some organizations and not others? How far is Bern willing to go to remain neutral? And what would it take for the nation to pick a side? Before we dive deeper into the key reasons why Switzerland has refused time and time again to join the European Union, let's first take a quick look at what neutrality means to the country and why it might not be as clear-cut as you might believe. When you think of Switzerland, you probably think of Swiss banks with loose regulations where money and riches can be safe from the authorities and foreign governments. You also probably picture the Swiss Alps and a beautiful landscape that's been spared from conflict for over a century due to its neutral stance. Oh, and cheese with holes in it. For these reasons, it might appear that Switzerland has remained neutral for so long to spare its lands and people from the ravages of war. However, looks can be deceiving, and the real reason why Switzerland has repeatedly turned down offers to join the EU and certain other international organizations is a little more complicated than what we see on the surface. Let's go back in time and examine one of the most tumultuous periods in European history. This will provide us a foundation for understanding how Swiss neutrality works and the way that the Swiss government makes decisions today. On September 1, 1939, Adolf Hitler ordered his Nazi army to invade Poland. World War II had begun, and many countries on the continent were forced to choose a side. But not everyone became a part of the Axis or the Allied powers. Switzerland decided it would remain neutral and informed both sides that it was staying out of the conflict. Switzerland and its Red Cross were given permission to repatriate captives, transfer grants in aid, and visit prisoner camps. The city of Geneva also held protective representation for leaders of 35 nations before the war broke out to broker some sort of resolution to the growing tensions. Throughout the war, Switzerland was left largely untouched. However, the fact that they were aiding both sides helped its cause. There's much controversy surrounding Switzerland's neutrality and the dealings it did during World War II, but this is a perfect example of why Switzerland won't join specific organizations like the European Union. What it comes down to is that, like with any nation, Switzerland is going to do what is best for Switzerland. And who can blame them? Switzerland provided assistance to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Some of its banks held Jewish money even after the war, until they were forced to pay reparations to Jewish families in 2018. To be fair, in World War II, the vast majority of Swiss citizens sympathized with the Allies and their cause, as they shared a democratic form of government. Watching Adolf Hitler's dictatorship and the Third Reich spread across Europe was likely terrifying for many Swiss people, but the fact that the country remained neutral provided some comfort. The Nazi regime promised not to invade Switzerland's borders as long as its neutral stance was maintained. That was unless Hitler conquered the Allies, then all bets were off, and there would have been little chance that Switzerland would have been spared from Nazi dominance. By remaining neutral, the Red Cross was allowed into territory controlled by both sides of the conflict to help those in need. Swiss neutrality also enabled Max Weibel, a Swiss intelligence official, to mediate a sit-down between an American official named Alan Dulles and German commanders in Italy to negotiate an early surrender that would save thousands of lives. There were pros and cons to remaining neutral in a global conflict. Now the world's more connected, while simultaneously being more divided than ever. Swiss neutrality is being pushed to its limits, while many countries and Europe are condemning the actions of Bern. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has the European Union concerned, as this is the first major conflict on the continent in decades. And although most countries in Europe are a part of NATO, meaning they receive support from the world's largest and most powerful military, the United States, Switzerland's continuous refusal to join the EU has baffled many. We'll dive deeper into the history of Swiss neutrality a bit later on, but let's discuss why Switzerland has yet to join the European Union. As you'll find out, it has less to do with remaining neutral than you might think. Number 1. Economics. One of the main reasons that Switzerland has consistently refused to join the EU is that it doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense. The Swiss economy is strong and stable. The country's GDP is around 740 billion euros a year, making it the 6th largest economy in Europe. Therefore, there's no real economic benefit to joining the EU. Switzerland already has free trade deals with most of the continent, and if it were to join the alliance, it would become one of the net contributors to the European Union. This means they would support countries with weaker economies and would not benefit much from doing so. In an ideal world, nations would help one another whenever they needed it, but that's not the world we live in. People working in Switzerland also earn much higher wages than most parts of Europe. The average Swiss salary is around 6,665 Swiss francs, or 6,971 euros a month. To put this into perspective, Switzerland's neighbor Italy has an average monthly salary of approximately 2,479 euros, meaning that the average wage is almost 3 times more in Switzerland than Italy. The concern with joining the EU is that it'll open Switzerland's borders and economy to wage dumping, where employers begin lowering salaries and undercutting one another because there's an influx of workers looking for jobs who are willing to do the same work for less. The Swiss are also concerned that there would be an influx of immigration into its welfare system as well. The free movement of people and workers throughout the European Union is one of the reasons why many supported Brexit in the UK. It's also why many Swiss citizens don't want their country to join the EU. The influx of new laborers could be detrimental to the Swiss workers. Joining the European Union likely wouldn't cause the Swiss economy to collapse, and an influx of workers could even boost the economy. Still, the fear of outsiders and what it'll do to wages and jobs has led to the majority of Swiss people voting against joining the EU. Then there are the regulations that come with joining the European Union. The anonymity and loose regulatory framework that many Swiss banks and financial institutions enjoy would be gone. Countries, businesses, and individuals that keep vast sums of money in Swiss banks would likely no longer feel comfortable doing so and pull their funds to put in financial institutions that operate in countries not associated with strict organizations such as the EU. This obviously would be bad for business and the Swiss economy. Interestingly, the neutrality that Switzerland has maintained by not joining the EU or other alliances has increased its arms sales industry. Some governments do not like buying weapons from countries that are tied to strict alliances. If Switzerland became a part of the EU, its neutrality would be brought into question. When a government purchases arms from a large military power such as the United States, Russia, or China, the weapons often come with strings attached. On the other hand, Switzerland's neutrality allows foreign governments to procure arms without having to worry about taking a side in future conflicts. This is very attractive to some nations and allows Switzerland to sell around 1 billion euros worth of weapons each year. Between 2021 and 2022, Swiss arms deals increased by 29%, showing that demand for their weapons is high. However, joining the European Union could hurt these sales rather than improve them. Number 2. Russia. It may seem counterintuitive, but Russia and the continued aggression against Ukraine is actually driving Switzerland away from forming alliances and joining the EU rather than toward it. Many nations have sought to strengthen their alliances in the wake of Russia's aggression. For example, both Finland and Sweden, 2 countries that remained neutral for decades, applied to join NATO. Finland has become a full member, and Sweden is waiting for one holdout, Turkey, to agree to its admittance into the organization. However, while some countries look to join alliances, Switzerland is heading the other direction. The difference between Switzerland and other neutral countries that are starting to join alliances is its location. Switzerland sits in the middle of the European continent, surrounded by Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and Liechtenstein. Germany and France are 2 of the strongest militaries in the world. Therefore, if Russia or another foreign threat ever decides to invade Europe or a member of the European Union, Switzerland would be surrounded by some heavy hitters who would serve as a barrier in a potential future conflict. Their landlocked location and neighbors protect the country even as it remains neutral. Sweden and Finland, on the other hand, don't have that same luxury. Finland shares a border of around 1,340 kilometers with Russia, and Sweden's massive coastline, which runs along the Baltic Sea, makes it susceptible to Russian naval vessels. There's no overwhelming security benefit for Switzerland if they were to join the European Union. Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon set up the Mutual Defense Clause, where if one member of the EU is attacked by an aggressor, the rest of the members will come to their aid. This basically negates any form of neutrality of countries that are part of the European Union. This is a massive turnoff for many Swiss policymakers and citizens. We'll discuss why neutrality is so important to Switzerland and the history it's ingrained into the Swiss culture. But for right now, it's important to know that many Swiss policy decisions consider the country's neutral stance ahead of all else. It's interesting to note that Switzerland does have a military and purchases weapons and vehicles from other nations. The Swiss armed forces have just over 100,000 active personnel, around 280 tanks, approximately 134 of which are Leopard 2s, and about 40 fighter aircraft, most being Lockheed Martin F-35s. The Swiss government recently passed a bill to increase military spending from 5.6 billion Swiss francs to 7 billion, or 5.86 billion euros to 7.33 billion euros by 2030. This would bring the total military budget above 1% of the country's total GDP. Between 1990 and 2019, Swiss military spending dropped from 1.34% to 0.67% of its GDP. Number 3. Politics. Joining the European Union is inviting to countries that have struggled through tumultuous governments in the past. The EU provides a form of stability in that all nations that are part of the organization must maintain a form of democratic government. This allows populations in the EU countries peace of mind. This is incredibly important for nations that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc or experienced some form of fascism in the past. Switzerland has maintained a stable democratic government for over a century. The trauma that's associated with living under an oppressive regime is long-lasting in a population, but this is not something Switzerland has had to contend with. The Swiss government has stood staunchly neutral in foreign affairs ever since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when it regained its independence. It's worked so well for so long that the government and Swiss citizens are hesitant to change the diplomatic view of the nation. Staying out of the European Union has given the Swiss government the autonomy to continue doing business as usual, allowing it to do what's best for Switzerland itself. This means the nation can continue to be a neutral ground where countries broker peace deals or conflicts can be discussed. If Switzerland became part of the EU, the autonomy to carry out impartial negotiations would be lost. And since Switzerland prides itself on being a safe space for discussions to occur, the policies of the government must reflect that stance. Switzerland is content with looking inward and bringing its citizens prosperity. The European Union allowed countries like France and Germany to extend their power and influence on a global scale. Bern has little interest in influencing global matters or expanding its control beyond its borders. Instead, by staying out of the European Union, Switzerland has remained autonomous, and it isn't forced to support other nations in the alliance to further foreign interests. At the individual level, the Swiss people hold tightly to their direct democracy. Many fear that joining the European Union would take away some of their political power that they hold today. For example, joining the alliance would restrict particular referendums that would not conform to EU ideals. For the most part, the Swiss do not want to see changes made to their own government, especially when they're dictated by outside forces, such as the European Commission. Therefore, joining the EU is not just unpopular at the government level, but at the individual level in Switzerland as well. When polled on why they don't want to join the EU, the number one concern for most Swiss citizens is that it would jeopardize their nation's sovereignty. This has led to slogans being created against Switzerland joining the EU, such as "foreign judges." The people of Switzerland embrace their independence and do not want outside forces interfering with how their country is run and how their lives are lived. The Swiss government has bilateral agreements with almost every nation in the European Union, and these agreements often benefit Switzerland more than the other country. It would make no sense for the government to give up these beneficial deals to join the EU when it's already getting everything it wants while remaining neutral. The status quo favors Switzerland right now, which is why the government, businesses, and people do not want to join the EU. But how did Switzerland get into such a strong position while remaining neutral for so long? And how has the past influenced the decisions being made in the present and the future? For the answers to these questions, we'll need to go back in time and examine how Switzerland got to where it is today. Swiss neutrality and the foundation of many of the diplomatic decisions the country currently makes began in 1648. Like all nations, the borders of Switzerland have changed over time as conflicts arose and ended on the European continent. However, the Peace of Westphalia, which brought an end to the 30 Years' War and was agreed upon in 1648, was the first formal declaration of neutrality for Switzerland. Unfortunately, in 1803, the Napoleonic Wars began, and regions of Switzerland were once again invaded and held by a foreign ruler until 1815, when the Congress of Vienna re-established the borders of the nation. Ever since then, Switzerland has remained neutral, at least to a certain extent. When Switzerland declared it would be a country of perpetual neutrality going forward at the Congress of Vienna, an agreement was made that the nation would not take part in future conflicts or provide mercenaries to any other country. In return, the nations of Europe promised not to fight any more wars on Swiss land. In 1874, the Swiss constitution was revised to function as a direct democracy by referendum. This meant that the people of Switzerland now had the right to vote on major decisions made in the country instead of having representatives be a proxy for what they wanted. When World War I broke out in 1914, Switzerland vowed to remain neutral. During this time, the Red Cross formed its own units that would aid the wounded throughout the conflict. After the conclusion of the Great War, the Treaty of Versailles once again reaffirmed Switzerland's neutrality. In 1920, Switzerland joined the League of Nations, which meant the government would work closely with other nations in Europe to maintain peace. The headquarters of the League was established in Geneva. However, over the next 2 decades, peace would fall apart, and Europe would be plunged into a Second World War. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, Switzerland's Federal Council declared the nation would once again remain neutral. This was somewhat true, as Switzerland and its institutions would aid both sides, but would engage in some questionable practices when it came to collecting and storing both Nazi and Jewish money. It has been argued that Switzerland's neutrality during World War II was an act of cowardice that allowed the Swiss government to distance itself from the Nazi atrocities while simultaneously benefiting from laundered German money. Others state that since Switzerland remained neutral, it allowed them to act as a mediator and bring the war to a close. The neutral nature of Switzerland and the ethics of its stance during World War II are still debated by historians. In 1959, Switzerland became one of the founding members of the European Free Trade Association. During this time, its 4-party government system was developed, which became known as the Magic Formula. Having 4 parties allowed for political stability and the balancing of ideas and ideologies in the government itself. However, there were still some difficulties and nationalist views that would arise. Right-wing groups campaigned to restrict the entry of foreign workers, and it wasn't until 1971 that women were given the right to vote in federal elections in Switzerland. It would take another 14 years after that for a referendum to finally pass that guaranteed women legal equality with men within their marriages. The Swiss people were still staunchly neutral during this time, and a referendum in 1986 for Switzerland to join the United Nations was shot down by a margin of 3-1. Conservative views around immigration and maintaining the status quo in Switzerland were largely popular at the time. In 1992, Switzerland joined the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, but rejected a proposal to join the European Economic Area. This was because joining the EEA would have resulted in more restrictions for Swiss businesses and served no real benefit to the country itself. For many nations, it became clear Switzerland was cherry-picking which organizations to join and deals to make in order to further its economic aspirations. The Swiss government had no intentions of becoming closer to the rest of Europe to create a more unified political, economic, and military organization. During the 1990s, there was a shift in the country to hold the Swiss government accountable and make reparations for past actions. In 1994, a referendum passed that made racial discrimination and the denial of the Holocaust illegal. The Swiss Banking Association was later pressured by activist and Jewish groups in 1998 to give back around 1.25 billion euros to Holocaust survivors and their families. This led to a settlement being paid out to those people for cash that had been continuously held in Swiss banks since World War II, instead of being returned to Jewish families. By the turn of the century, things began to change in Switzerland. A 1999 election saw more right-wing votes for the Swiss People's Party. This conservative group became Switzerland's second strongest political party by securing around a quarter of the populace's votes. And even though the Swiss people rejected a proposal to open talks about joining the European Union in 2001, the Swiss parliament overwhelmingly voted to join the United Nations, as the UN was a peacekeeping organization. When the vote to join the UN was put to referendum, it passed with only a slight majority, as many Swiss citizens believed that it would entangle their country in foreign affairs and jeopardize the nation's long-standing neutrality. Even still, Switzerland ended up joining the United Nations the following year. In 2003, the right-wing Swiss People's Party became the most represented political party in parliament. It won close to 28% of the votes in the general election. That December, the Swiss People's Party gained a second post in the 7-seat government, while the Christian Democrats lost one, altering the magic formula that's kept Swiss politics stable since 1959. With the right-wing political group now more prominent in the government, naturalization laws became more strict. By 2006, voters in a national referendum supported plans to make Switzerland's asylum laws some of the toughest in the Western world. In the 2007 elections, the Swiss People's Party increased its standing when it received nearly 29% of the vote. Up until this point, the Swiss government, which increased support for the right-wing Swiss People's Party, had made decisions that kept Switzerland away from policies that could bring the nation's neutrality into question. However, in January 2009, the Swiss economy went into recession. The government announced it would relax some of its banking secrecy laws and cooperate with international investigations concerning tax evasion. By the following year, the Swiss economy was growing again. In 2011, it was decided by the government that the Swiss franc would be pegged to the euro. This was in response to businesses and manufacturers warning that the strength of the franc was making Swiss exports uncompetitive in the European market. pegging the Swiss franc to the euro would keep the country from falling into a second recession in only a few years. In October 2011, the Swiss People's Party started losing support and seats in the parliamentary elections. It still remained the largest party, but its numbers were dwindling. Switzerland reimposed strict immigration quotas on workers from Central and Eastern Europe. The EU criticized this move, but Switzerland carried on anyway. It became more and more clear that even though some hoped the Swiss would join the EU around this time, that dream was far from becoming a reality. When the euro began to depreciate in 2014, the Swiss National Bank unpegged the franc, causing its currency to rise drastically. Then came the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. During COVID, the world remained isolated. Being neutral was easy. However, as Sweden and Finland found out, neutrality was much harder to maintain when Russia invaded Ukraine. There are two views on Swiss neutrality by its citizens in the current climate. The first is more conservative and supported by the Swiss People's Party. This side wants to maintain a strict interpretation of neutrality by not sending aid to Ukraine or engaging with Russia. The idea is Switzerland will remain neutral no matter what happens in the rest of Europe to keep the country out of any conflicts. The Swiss People's Party is even trying to launch an initiative to embed a comprehensive neutrality clause within the Swiss constitution. The more liberal side of the neutrality argument, which is supported by the majority of the government, is considered active neutrality. This would allow Switzerland to work with other organizations and nations such as the UN to play an active role in maintaining peace and aiding in humanitarian efforts. Switzerland already abides by UN sanctions, which shows that it has taken a more actively neutral stance than a conservative one. However, even many liberal Swiss are still not willing to join the European Union, as it would cause Switzerland to definitely give up its neutrality while simultaneously bringing Swiss sovereignty into question. To ensure that active neutrality is not confused with Switzerland taking a strong stance against Russia, it's banned NATO members from flying over its airspace while bringing supplies and weapons to Ukraine. Bern has also refused to grant Germany and Denmark permission to give Ukraine any tanks, ammunition, or weapons bought from Switzerland. This has caused much of Europe and NATO to condemn Switzerland's neutral stance as Russia continues to wage a war against Ukraine and its people. Bern can remain neutral since Switzerland is protected by its geographic location and the nations surrounding it. Even as other countries scramble to join organizations like NATO, Switzerland has the luxury of holding on to its neutrality. The concept is deeply ingrained in Switzerland's culture and will not be given up easily, which is why the Swiss have continually refused to join the European Union. Until there's a clear economic or political incentive for Switzerland to give up its neutrality and form closer ties with other European nations, it's very unlikely the government or the Swiss people will vote to become a part of the EU anytime soon. With the invasion of Ukraine going on for more than 2 years at the time this video was written, it's become pretty obvious that Putin doesn't want to back down. But what many fail to realize is that Russia's grand plans of returning to its imperialist borders have only just begun. And one of the key barriers to Russia's expansion is NATO. Putin's already enacted multiple strategies with NATO. Even though Russia and NATO aren't fighting directly, you could say they are at war. And while that war might not actually be on the battlefield, it could only be a matter of time before it escalates to that point. But how exactly are NATO and Russia at odds with one another? To learn that, it's best to take a look at Putin's exact demands that led to this horrid situation. Shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Putin approached NATO to discuss the following 3 hard boundaries that would need to be maintained. 1. Prevent NATO's expansion close to Russia's borders, including removing the ability for Ukraine to join NATO. 2. Remove deployed weapons and military near borders with Russia. And 3. Dismantle NATO military bases in countries that joined NATO after 1996, when the first provisional NATO-Russia agreement was reached. In each of these points, Russia has identified a key weakness in its influence and political power. The EU's and NATO's expansion have provided Europe with a unitary approach to both economy and military, weakening Russia's ability to exert demands on former Soviet and Warsaw Pact countries. This means that Russia has been slowly losing allies from its West. Ultimately, with the technological advancements in warfare, especially long-range missile capabilities, Moscow and the other wealthy and influential Russian leading population centers in Europe could feasibly be within reach in a hypothetical war against NATO, which is precisely what drove Putin to invade Ukraine in the first place. As one of the countries with historically strong ties to Russia, Ukraine was the ultimate Russian stronghold in Europe. It's one of the few countries with a significant Russian population and has a land border with both NATO countries and Russia. Ukraine joining NATO would defeat Russia's multi-decade effort to influence and retain military control in Soviet countries. This has been one of the most long-standing strategies that the Kremlin has used to exert its will on other countries, with key examples being current issues in Moldova and Georgia. The strategy has also proven partially successful in Ukraine before, considering the Russian annexation of Crimea, which was one of the precursors for NATO bolstering its expansion efforts. That's why Putin's ultimate goal is to try to dismantle NATO, whether through direct or indirect efforts. One of the key Russian efforts to undermine NATO's authority is the near-constant threat of war with NATO countries. While this primarily comes alongside the threat of using nuclear weapons, of which Russia is the world's biggest stockpiler, a traditional invasion is something that many European countries have slowly been considering as a real possibility. In leaked military documents, the German Defense Ministry goes so far as to envision Russia attacking NATO directly at some point in this year. The documents go into the details of Russia winning the war in Ukraine and starting to create a military front in the Kaliningrad Oblast and Belarus, which currently allows free transit for Russian military and soldiers. It should be noted that many documents that national ministries of defense and militaries prepare are worst-case scenarios and are therefore highly unlikely to be realistic. However, Germany itself has ramped up its defense spending, meaning that it's likely it'll take the current Russian threat seriously. So, how does Russia plan to attack NATO directly? In this hypothetical war, the Russian region of Kaliningrad would be a vital asset for any invasion. Nestled between Poland and Lithuania, Kaliningrad and Belarus create a natural flanking position for the Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile border between the two NATO countries. Russia maintains a large military presence in Kaliningrad by ramping up the country's defense sector since 2008 to keep it more isolated from its European neighbors, which it sees as negatively influencing Kaliningrad culturally and ideologically. As we mentioned before, Belarus is one of the closest Russian allies in the invasion and is currently hosting Russian soldiers and long-range artillery equipment to extend the Russo-Ukrainian front. By reinforcing the military in Kaliningrad and Belarus, Russia can effectively create a barrier between Poland and Lithuania, effectively cutting off the Baltic countries from the rest of mainland Europe. If Russia then invades one of the Baltic countries and the Suwalki Gap simultaneously, other NATO countries would be forced to funnel their land forces through the gap. Some strategists have previously noted that this move could lead to tens of thousands of NATO casualties within the first few days of the invasion. While NATO's total military heavily outnumbers Russia, Russian conscription efforts have been nothing short of monumental. According to some reports, Russia has lost around 320,000 soldiers over the past 2 years of fighting in Ukraine. That is close to 90% of Russia's total military manpower deployed in Ukraine at the start of the invasion. By some accounts, Russia had around 470,000 troops stationed in the occupied Ukrainian territory at the start of 2024. By contrast, Germany, a country with around half of Russia's population, has a total military size estimated at around 181,000. Of course, one of the biggest flaws in Russia's offensive plans on the Baltic has been the recent integration of Sweden and Finland into NATO. With these two countries joining NATO, Russia's direct land border with NATO has nearly doubled in length. This means that NATO could feasibly invade Russia through its north, forcing the Russian army to divide its troops between the Baltic states and the Finnish-Norwegian border. Additionally, Sweden and Finland are in NATO, which means the almost entire Baltic Sea is under NATO control. Since Kaliningrad is the only Russian port in the Baltic Sea that stays ice-free throughout the year, NATO can easily blockade Kaliningrad. If the combined Baltic fleets of NATO countries attacks Kaliningrad, it would further pressure Russia to assign vital troops to defend the ports rather than holding the Suwalki Gap. Even in this scenario, Russia has something that NATO lacks, and that's sheer disregard for how it treats its soldiers. While this is not particularly positive, it can mean a whole world of difference if Russia fully utilizes its army. By throwing every available soldier into the meat grinder, Russia can try to win a war of attrition against NATO. While it could have deadly repercussions, it could be just the sort of desperate strategy that no one will expect Putin to actually implement, and therefore countries might not expect the approach. If NATO doesn't account for this possibility, if it already hasn't, it could severely underestimate the initial strength of the Russian army. This is mainly because most European countries have vastly different views of conscription. For example, once Germany ended mandatory military service, its army, the Bundeswehr, shrunk from around 310,000 troops to the aforementioned 180,000. This difference is solely due to a lack of interest in military service in the country. If the figures could be replicated across the NATO countries in Europe, it could mean that Russia could be fighting 500,000 fewer troops than they would have had those countries had mandatory military service. As such, Russia could take the next few years to rebuild its troops and use a larger army advantage to push into Europe. This is further made possible by the unequal military spending between NATO countries. While all members are technically recommended to allocate at least 2% of their GDP for defense spending, less than half of countries actually do so. Germany, for example, made international headlines after the invasion of Ukraine when the government announced boosting its defense spending to the recommended 2%. On the other hand, Russia is predicted to spend roughly a third of its annual budget on the military alone in 2024, as evidenced by its budget allocation. While this isn't much compared to what China and the US spend, Russia might not have to worry about these armies for a while. For one, China is currently maintaining friendly relations with Russia. It took over most of Russia's oil and natural gas trading deals after the EU sanctioned Russia and removed its dependence on the Russian supply. However, another more important factor is that NATO might not be able to count on the US to join the fray if a war breaks out in Europe. While the US is obligated to abide by NATO's Article 5, which prompts all countries to join in wars, the US might not be in NATO for much longer, and that would all have to do with politics. You see, the current President Joe Biden's administration has a pretty positive view on NATO. However, the presidential elections in 2024 are pitting Biden against former President Donald Trump, one of the most polarizing political personalities in the world. Aside from amassing over 30 felony charges, Trump has been pretty vocal about his sordid opinion on NATO. He believes that the US should not feel obligated to be a member of the pact since it's by far the biggest contributor of military funding, even if only in percentage of GDP by country. While the US's defense contribution is around 3.5% of its GDP, Poland is allocating 3.9%. The pact's average is only 2.64%, and not every country has reached the recommended 2% threshold. According to the latest polls, Trump is inching ahead of Biden by around 1%. While that might not be a significant difference, and the figures fluctuate between one poll to the next, it shows that Trump could feasibly win the 2024 elections. If that happens, Trump could push for a vote in Congress to leave NATO, which requires a 2/3 majority. After a country has announced that it wants to leave NATO, the process is automatic, and it only requires a 1-year notice to the US, at least currently. So, even in the scenario where Trump wins and immediately starts pushing for the country to leave NATO, the US will feasibly remain until early 2026. However, even if the US is still in NATO, that doesn't mean that European countries are guaranteed to receive help from the US, according to Article 5. While the article is a part of NATO's founding charters, it's not a legally binding contract. Trump could just refuse to cooperate with Article 5 and leave European countries to themselves. While this is highly unlikely due to the international backlash the US would receive, it might just be possible. If Trump's administration decided to improve its relationship with Russia or adopt a more isolationist stance, there's no telling what the repercussions could be on the global stage. Similarly, Russia doesn't want to leave the US elections up to chance. Multiple reports have suggested that Russia has interfered with US politics and elections in both 2016 and 2020. This means that Russia already has a well-developed playbook on how to operate and distort the existing information present in US media and fit its desired narrative. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence has suggested that Russian efforts to undermine democracy and infuse American media with more content to further its agenda will only escalate in the coming years. This will mean that Putin has already concocted a plan to ally himself with Trump and have the US leave NATO to start the process of dismantling NATO. And there's always the threat of using nuclear weaponry. One of the key reasons why Russia is so heavily reinforcing Kaliningrad is due to its favorable location in Europe. With modern missile launching capabilities, precision strikes from Kaliningrad could hit every European NATO capital before the countries could deploy their anti-air defenses. In May 2022, the Russian army hosted a military exercise in Kaliningrad, providing a detailed simulation of their missile launchers. Since this equipment is capable of deploying both traditional long-range missiles and nuclear ones, it's a clear show of force and possibly intent for NATO countries to see. However, Putin has used the nuclear threat quite often over the past few years. It's been one of the Kremlin's favorite defense mechanisms whenever NATO announces new military donations to Ukraine. But this saber-rattling has yet to yield results with world leaders, since Ukraine has consistently received more advanced weaponry since the invasion. Or is that really Putin's goal? While the threat of nuclear warfare might certainly rattle world leaders and significantly delay traditional aid to Ukraine, world leaders might not be the intended target for Putin. That could be the regular citizens. Faced with constant nuclear threats looming on the horizon, the citizens of NATO countries could become apathetic or even contrary to the causes supported by the pro-military leaders. Given enough propaganda, time, and fear-mongering, it's not out of the realm of possibility to imagine countries further curbing their military budgets because even fewer people sign up for military service or abandon conscription. This could be a real blow to NATO's military power and give Putin another way to dismantle the alliance from within. Faced with a choice of fighting for countries that are not their own and the fear that Putin's wrath might result in the bombing of their cities out of existence, soldiers could easily opt out. Then some world leaders might abandon warfare and turn to the negotiating table. Only this time Russia would have the upper hand and could enforce its demands in return for keeping the status quo on nuclear weapons. Considering how little Russia can invest in the strategy and how much it can get, this could be a lucrative way to approach negotiations. While risky, this plan could make Putin one of the most successful leaders in Russian history. This part of Putin's plan has been so well developed that it has its own name, dubbed the reflexive control theory. It involves giving your opponents information so that their response can be uniquely predetermined to align with your goals. In Russia's case, the threats of war are constantly escalating the situation. If NATO comes up with a plan to help Ukraine end the war in its favor, Putin could counter that with another nuclear threat, forcing NATO to reconvene and ultimately curb its aid to Ukraine, or ultimately decide against it altogether. As soon as there's news about planned military exercises in Russia with equipment that could be used for nuclear warfare or simulating it, NATO would try to demonstrate that it won't present a nuclear threat itself. This attempt to de-escalate the situation allows Putin to effectively control the rhetoric of how much NATO countries can invest in helping Ukraine, or even guide their own governments on military matters. One of the great examples here would be the nuclear arsenals of European NATO countries. There are only two of those, the UK and France. But so far, Putin hasn't been worried about either NATO country using their nuclear weapons because their legislation prohibits their use unless the country is under direct threat. That means that even if, for example, the Baltic countries were attacked with nuclear weapons by Russia, the nuclear weapons in France and the UK would remain unavailable to the rest of NATO. If Putin maintains Russia's offensive by reflexive control, he can continue to threaten nuclear war as soon as either the UK or France announce a change in how they're willing to use its nuclear warhead supplies. This leaves the US as the only nuclear-ready nation. Considering that Trump being elected could take the US out of the equation, Putin can maintain his upper hand and use the reflexive control methodology to win the war in Ukraine by forcing NATO's hand. Reflexive control is also the key reason why Ukraine hasn't been allowed to join NATO before. Due to Putin's previous threats, if the country were to join NATO, Putin could have invaded, forced the rest of NATO to invoke Article 5, and then plunged the entirety of Europe into war. It's also why NATO hasn't so far directly deployed its troops to defend Ukraine, but only keeps sending ammunition and equipment. But as mentioned earlier, it's not just military warfare that Putin has in store for Europe. One of Russia's key pressures on NATO has also been the country's economies. The invasion of Ukraine also marked a turning point in the world's effort to recover from economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most predictions in late 2021 suggested that the global economy would bounce back with 5% growth in 2022, but a year later, the economy grew only by 3.1%, and the forecast for 2023 was similarly grim at only 2.2%. European countries were hit the worst, with average economic growth of only 0.2%. By contrast, Russia was almost immediately beset by economic sanctions upon invading Ukraine. According to the BBC, at the 2-year mark from the start of the invasion, around 4,000 entities were sanctioned by the US to prevent Russia from gaining vital access to technology and funds to keep fueling its war effort. The total number of sanctions against Russia is now more than 17,000. The world gambled that the severed trade relations would drain the country's coffers and prevent it from waging an extended war. Yet despite all the odds, Russia managed to surpass its growth projection by double, from 1.3% to 2.6% in 2023, compared to the European average of 0.9%. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia's economic growth has slowed by a cumulative 5% over the 2 years since the invasion. However, the Russian economy has managed to grow despite that. Effectively, the sanctions imposed on Russia have only slowed how much money it can invest into its military. Russia has managed to keep its inflation in check thanks to the aggressive bank interest rates and shifting its export strategy. Finding itself unable to export its materials and resources to Europe, Russia turned to China and Central Asia as its next biggest benefactors. It secured a lucrative deal with China to export oil, albeit at a discounted price of what it used to set for the European market. Despite that, the country managed to earn $15.6 billion in oil export revenue in January 2024. If Putin carefully navigates global geopolitics to keep these trade deals and the price of oil stays put, Russia could theoretically fund its war machine forever, solely due to favorable exports. Additionally, according to the budget reports for 2024, Russia might be going all in on the war effort and bolstering its military. A report by Reuters suggests that Russia will freeze its spending on education and healthcare, while also heavily curbing its investments in infrastructure and construction. This could point to a concerted effort to win the war in Ukraine and move on to the next goal as quickly as possible. If Putin can manage to win back Ukraine and enforce Russia's demands on the world stage, then the local economic losses from unequal spending could easily be recouped by Russia's greater presence and access to capital from enforced global trade. Perhaps more importantly, Russia's acts on the world stage, militarily and economically, have started a noticeable shift against global trade. According to a report by Rutgers, the two major blocs, the US and China, have started to drift apart economically, with over 31% less bilateral trade since 2018. That means that the countries in their respective blocs have started looking more favorably toward the other countries that their main trading partner already uses. This would also mean that the economic structure, if this trend continues, would more readily approach the situation present during the Cold War, where the two sides pretty much exclusively dealt only with their bloc and forewent any serious global trade. While some economists believe that this trend would spell doom for Russia, the country's economy has proven more resilient than previously imaginable. If Russia could maintain economic growth despite sanctions, allying with China and more closely depending on the world's second-largest economy could prove to have its merits. While China is technically a neutral party in the war, its interests are more closely aligned with that of Russia. It's also one of the US's biggest political and economic rivals, and its trade routes are more vulnerable to American interference. If China manages to exploit more of Russia's resources, providing Putin with much-needed money and war technology in return, then both countries could seemingly share these goals and try to undermine the global economy. But how likely are all of these plans to work? On the military front, Sweden and Finland's accession into NATO has put a significant wrench into Putin's plan to utilize the Suwalki Gap to its fullest extent. With the land border extended, NATO can create a more effective counteroffensive and undermine Putin's efforts to control Kaliningrad. Furthermore, even if Trump wins the 2024 elections and starts the process of removing the US from NATO, the vote is ultimately not up to him. It would likely take a restructuring of Congress to get the vote passed, meaning that the decision could be postponed by a year or more. Furthermore, even if the US leaves NATO, it can still elect independently to go to war against Russia if the latter decides to mount an attack on Europe. Even with the US out of the picture, it's not certain whether Russia can mount a successful military campaign in Europe, due to most of the European countries agreeing that Russia has become a threat and many pledging to increase their military spending and readiness. Russia might face a front more united than it first appears. Economically, Russia is also on its back foot. While its current trade relations with China are lucrative, Russia's efforts to expand its economy and influence are heavily undermined by the US and the EU. If either decides to encroach on China's trade deals more heavily, China could try to force a deal with Russia that might not go in Putin's favor. Additionally, China itself could be a military threat to Russia if it considers that access to Siberia and Russia's current preoccupation with Ukraine are worth the risk. But what do you think? Do Putin's plans of destroying NATO have any merit, or will the alliance prove to be unbreakable and force Putin to reassess Russia's imperialistic tendencies? Let us know in the comments. It was a bombshell announcement that sent shockwaves around the world. During an international conference, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that deploying Western troops into Ukraine was not out of the question. The announcement was met with immediate condemnation by both NATO states and Russia itself, with Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stating that sending any Western troops into Ukraine would not be in the best interests of any involved party. Yet, Macron has seen the writing on the wall. The situation in Ukraine is precarious, and should Ukraine fall, NATO might not have a choice when it comes to war against Russia. To be fair, Macron was largely speaking of sending non-combatant troops, similar to the known presence of British troops inside Ukraine, assisting with the logistics of various weapon systems sent there. However, he was purposefully ambiguous about sending combat troops, or at least attempting to be for strategic gain, by injecting doubt into Moscow's war plans about the possibility of having to face the military might of NATO in Ukraine. Yet the immediate response from multiple NATO members, stating that this would absolutely not happen, effectively killed that plan. Macron was not entirely incorrect when he stated years ago that NATO was, quote, brain dead. The fact of the matter is that there is far more at stake than Ukraine, and NATO has been criminally irresponsible in the last 2 years, happily enjoying the peace of its own lands while sending largely symbolic amounts of equipment to stem Russian aggression. It's clear that Russia has greater plans than just Ukraine, as evidenced by a September 2021 security guarantee presented to the United States, where Ukraine is only mentioned twice, and Russia called for a halt to any further NATO membership and demilitarization of Central Europe by NATO. The document has some reasonable points, such as each nation no longer staging nuclear weapons outside of their own borders. That's a compromise that heavily favors Russia, but a reasonable request for the sake of the world not turning into a massive fallout LARP. Yet the demand that NATO effectively demilitarize Central Europe only favors Russia and had a very specific intent to intimidate the Baltics and Poland. The Baltic states remain NATO's most vulnerable members, with a population of around 6 million between all three of them, and being difficult to reinforce in case of Russian invasion, thanks to the choke point caused by the Suwałki Gap. The gap is the only strip of land that connects the Baltics to Poland, and thus the rest of NATO, and through which NATO forces would have to drive to counterattack the Russian offensive. Yet the gap is surrounded on both sides by Belarus, a Russian proxy state, and Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian enclave. If NATO forces attempt to drive north through the gap, they would be hammered on both sides by air and missile attacks, and the lack of infrastructure makes it impossible to move large amounts of troops quickly, especially if there's a steady stream of refugees trying to flee the fighting. Pushing major NATO combat power as far west as Germany means that the Baltics and Poland would feel ever more exposed. Poland likewise is in a poor defensive position, given that it occupies a large swath of the flat European plain. This is terrain that favors Russia's massive armored forces, which may technologically be inferior, but as the fighting in Ukraine has proven, quantity has a significant quality all its own. Then there's Moldova, which sits on Ukraine's western flank. The breakaway province of Transnistria is pro-Russian and currently hosts between 1,000 to 2,000 Russian troops. It's known that at the start of the Ukraine invasion, Russia hoped to launch a seaborne assault on Odessa along the Ukrainian southern coast, but the operation was halted due to weather and a series of setbacks. Had such an assault succeeded, though, Russia would have been able to push west and link up with Transnistria. An assault on Moldova would have been inevitable, all under the guise of liberating Russian speakers. If Russia wins in Ukraine, such an assault is equally inevitable, bringing Russian forces ever closer to the very vulnerable heart of Europe. For too long has the West been blissfully and ignorantly happy to ignore the Russian threat, drunk off the peace dividend they reaped when the West won history at the end of the Cold War. But Russia never forgot the humiliation, and Russia expansion into Europe has always been a matter of national survival. The nation sits at the far end of the European plain, and its naval ports are all easily choked off. Restoring the old Soviet bloc adds a buffer against any possible European invasion, as the nation has suffered repeatedly throughout its history and widens Russia's ability to project naval power past its own shores. But for all the naysayers who want to believe that even if Russia wins in Ukraine, that would be the end of it, expansion is also almost certainly an existential matter. The Russian state is in an inevitable decline. The nation is poorly diversified economically, with over half of its GDP coming from the sale of fossil fuels. Increasingly, it's not even able to sell more lucrative refined products due to technological bans from the West. Instead, it has to export low-profit crude oil that other nations like India and China then refine and resell for a substantial profit. Combined with the price cap imposed by the European Union and its two major customers, China and India, exploiting its weakened position to negotiate heavy discounts, the Russian economy is inevitably going to shrink. At the moment, it's being propped up by the estimated $312 billion in reserves the nation had available at the start of the Ukraine war, with $300 billion of the total $612 billion frozen in Western banks. Those reserves will run out, with some, like Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale, estimating Russia may have another year and a half to 2 years left. But it doesn't matter anyway, because the world is transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, an inevitable process that just isn't necessary to stabilize our climate, but one that is a top national defense priority for many nations. The massive leverage Russia was able to exert on Europe at the start of the Ukraine war due to the reliance on Russian oil was a warning sign to the world. If you don't want to be held hostage by foreign powers who either provide your energy or can interdict your energy shipments, you need to produce it domestically and renewably. This means that over the next half-century, Russia stands to lose as much as over half of its GDP. The nation's inability to innovate technologically, thanks to poor investments and an ongoing brain drain from the exodus of young professionals, also means Russia is not competitive in the information space, the hallmark of a robust and modern economy. Russia's Yandex, which was Google's largest competition in the region, was recently acquired by state-backed groups at a significantly discounted price, evidence that the entire endeavor is unraveling. Originally, Putin had wanted to nationalize Yandex so as to exert greater control over the information space, but was warned that its technical specialists would all quit and protest. Then there's the Russian Far East, a region rich in energy resources that China has been hungrily eyeing for 2 decades now. The ethnic Russian population there is rapidly shrinking as Russians move west, closer to Moscow, and they're being replaced by an influx of Chinese immigrants. Chinese investments in the region now significantly outweigh Russian investments, and Chinese culture has begun to displace Russian culture, with a Chinese official maps agency last year revealing new maps naming Chinese territory seized by the Russian Empire in the 17th through 19th century in their native Chinese names. The intention is clear: China wants a big bite out of Russia, and Russia might not be able to prevent it. Russia is doomed to become a second-rate economy and global power. But much like empires throughout history, territorial expansion could delay or outright avert such a disaster. Seizing Ukraine, the Baltics, even Poland, all nations with diversified and technologically leaning economies, could inject the new Russian Empire with the economic lifeblood that it needs to remain competitive and stave off inevitable collapse. Russia has every incentive to win in Ukraine and keep going, even if Europe is still too irresponsibly asleep at the wheel to acknowledge it. Is this realistic, though? Does Putin honestly think he can continue his campaign? One need only look at the current state of affairs both at home and abroad in Russia. The nation has begun to mobilize its industry for war-rate production. In October of 2023, Putin created a new military council that would oversee domestic industry and had the legal power to direct specific industries and even gain control over their budgets in order to take a direct managerial role. While defense industry workers were already moved to round-the-clock shifts back in summer, new legislation also allowed for employees to have vacations canceled or overtime enforced on them. The State Duma also announced legislation allowing the government to seize the assets of any company ending its Russian operations. While this would have significant effect on discouraging investment into Russia, both now and the future, should sanctions be dropped, the fact that Russia is willing to cut itself off from international financing is a very troubling sign that Russia has charted a course for its own future, one that does not include Western businesses reintroducing themselves into Russia. And this prepares the nation for a larger-scale war against NATO. To make matters worse, Russia has taken the measure of NATO and found it severely lacking. Despite NATO economies and military power dwarfing Russia, the alliance has for 2 years completely failed to stop Russian aggression inside of Ukraine. The entire alliance has failed to meet Putin's aggression head-on, with NATO leaders pussyfooting around Putin's naked hostilities and self-deterring from providing the military aid Ukraine desperately needs. Only nations like Poland, directly on the firing line of a future war with Russia, have taken the situation seriously enough to send significant amounts of aid. What aid has been provided has been piecemeal, always negotiated down from what was originally proposed out of fear of provoking Russia, and delivered in unpredictable spurts that leave Ukraine unable to coordinate its military campaign. If Ukraine doesn't know when the next aid shipment will come and what will come with it, it simply can't afford to wage decisive campaigns and risk losing equipment that might not be replaced. NATO's flaccid response to Russian aggression has proven to Putin that he can indeed intimidate the militarily superior alliance. But it's also exposed a significant weakness that 30 years of dominating low-intensity conflict in Africa and the Middle East has hidden. NATO's defense industry is abysmal. The alliance routinely produces true world-beating weapons. Russian engineers would kill their own babushkas for access to the Storm Shadow, the F-35, or German diesel-electric submarines. but Western defense industries are basically artisanal compared to the Russian megalith. Russia might pump out equipment that would have been impressive back in the 1980s compared to NATO's reverse-engineered UFO technology, but that doesn't matter when NATO stocks run out within weeks of fighting, or when they can't send tanks to Ukraine and establish longer-term resupply of tanks because their industries can't produce replacements fast enough. Russian industry is believed to be creating about 400 new tanks a year, with many more being refurbished from dwindling but still significant reserves. The US, meanwhile, produces just 120 Abrams a year, and the vaunted Leopard is truly an endangered species, with an estimated 50 tanks or so produced a year, and 60 to 70 modernized a year. The situation for Germany is so bad that it'll take years for the nation to modernize and fully equip its own armor forces at this rate. With the mobilization of its industry, Russia is set to dramatically expand tank production and refurbishment. Meanwhile, the West is basically creating artisanal levels of weapons, with each nut and bolt lovingly handcrafted by master artisans living high on mountaintop retreats, and even then only when the muses strike them with inspiration. Russia, meanwhile, is pumping out tanks that might be inferior, but in enough numbers to achieve Russia's preferred strategy of victory by means of literally absorbing every bullet and anti-tank missile until you're out of ammo. The nation has an incredible tolerance for pain, taking nearly 100,000 estimated KIA in 2 years of fighting, more than the US suffered in 20 years of fighting in Vietnam. Europe has been slowly waking up to the fact that Russian victory in Ukraine would result in Russia having the largest and most experienced land army in Europe, able to leverage additional Ukrainian manpower, and with an industry and society that's already been fully mobilized for war, despite 20 months ago, France's Macron stating that Russia must not be, quote, humiliated. Today he's singing a different tune and attempting to compel the rest of Europe to wake up and act before it's too late. His fears are well-founded too, with Ukrainian setbacks across the front with Russia. These setbacks are all the direct result of two factors: Europe's inability to properly supply Ukraine and the stalling out of American aid to the nation. Shell shortage directly led to the fall of Avdiivka and further reversals, and today Ukrainian forces are once more having to carefully ration their ammunition. Meanwhile, Russia has imported millions of rounds from abroad and has significantly stepped up domestic production. Europe, on the other hand, failed to meet more than 50% of the million rounds promised in 2023, though Macron has led the effort in the EU, overturning a ban on buying foreign shells, and the EU is now looking to purchase supplies from Europe. This shell legislation that once mandated shells only be procured within the EU is a prime example of the selfish, short-sighted, and irresponsible attitude of the West. While Ukraine is caught in a struggle for its survival and a war that will define the future struggle for Europe, the EU is more interested in continuing to bolster its own economy. Europe has prioritized its own economic well-being for decades, and Putin's charges that Europeans were weak and unable to tolerate pain have proven true. Meanwhile, the United States helped ensure Ukraine's current failures. MAGA sympathizers within the American Congress have continued to hamstring legislation that would provide war-winning levels of military support for Ukraine. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson has repeatedly refused to put a bill that would provide both funding for Ukraine and for border security to a vote. And the wide consensus, even amongst other Republicans increasingly frustrated with MAGA, is that he's only doing so to give federal criminal defendant Donald Trump ammunition for his presidential campaign. The Trump campaign wishes to exploit the southern border crisis for political points and is actively working to sabotage any effort that would resolve that crisis. Unfortunately, Ukrainian aid is tied up with a bill that other Republicans have agreed to already, which is why Johnson refuses to put it up for a vote. Trump's comments that he would allow or even encourage Russia to attack NATO members who did not meet 2% funding goals is also more troubling evidence that Johnson's tampering with Ukrainian aid might be about more than just providing fuel for the Trump campaign. The end result is that Putin is now more confident that given a Republican win in 2024, he may be granted the leverage to continue his war past Ukraine, even into NATO itself. Trump has repeatedly stated sentiments to the effect that he would pull the U.S. out of the alliance, and there are few who believe a Trump presidency would be willing to fulfill NATO Article 5 commitments over a Russian attack in the Baltics or Poland. The dark realization that America, the very linchpin of NATO, is no longer a reliable ally, has sent shockwaves around the world. It has undermined U.S. efforts not just in Europe, but in the Pacific, as Pacific partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia question the reliability of America in defending against Chinese aggression. This has helped galvanize some in Europe to take the Russian matter more seriously, and given Macron reason to think that the time may come when European powers may need to fight Russia inside of Ukraine or risk doing so on their own borders. The Cold War peace dividend is at an end. Now it's up to the West to decide which war to fight, the current one in Ukraine or a future one in the heart of Europe against a much stronger Russia. Russia is preparing for a full-scale war with NATO by 2026, so says an alleged leak of German intelligence. That leak supports this conclusion by pointing out the reorganization of the Russian army, movement of troops along the border with the West, and repositioning of both conventional and nuclear missile forces, and the mobilization of the Russian defense industry. Within 5 years, the report states, Russian strength could double. As of the writing of this script, the veracity of the report has yet to be confirmed, but even without confirmation, what the alleged report states is clearly evident already. But wait, we can hear you saying in the comments section already, didn't you report for 2 years that Russia was weak, infographic show? Well, just because your dad never came back from the store doesn't mean that things can't change. What has prompted this new stance on Russia, who up until last fall was seen as a rapidly diminishing power? How did we get here, and how confident can we be about further Russian aggression in the future? It all comes down to Western support for Ukraine, as it so often does. When the history of this war is written, no matter what happens next, one thing will be clear. The West refused to take the Russian threat seriously and treated Ukraine as an afterthought, sending nothing more than token military aid because it was never serious about defeating Russia. Even 2 years into the war, we still don't have a definitive statement from either the US or NATO that its goal is a Russian defeat. For his many gross missteps in this conflict, the one thing that Putin has done expertly is make the West brown its collective pants at any thought of Russian escalation, effectively neutering all but token bits of aid for Ukraine. We need look no further than France's Emmanuel Macron, who at the start of the war, even as the Russians were being forced to retreat from Kyiv in a humiliating defeat, stated that Russia must not be, quote, humiliated. Well, 2 years later, we have a completely different Macron who, as one of the few European leaders who has seen the writing on the wall, is now mulling over the possibility of sending French troops into Ukraine with or without NATO support. To see how we got here, it's also helpful to compare Western aid versus Russia's own ability to resupply its forces. In early 2023, the West finally agreed to send Leopard 2s, Challengers, and Abrams tanks to Ukraine. The West celebrated the move, and predictions of catastrophic Russian defeats and Ukrainian forces taking Moscow by fall made the rounds across the media. Much to the West's collective surprise, though, a paltry force of barely over 100 tanks, not even all delivered in time for summer, failed to win the war in one fell swoop, versus Russia's thousands of tanks and IFVs. Truly, not even Sun Tzu could have possibly predicted that a few dozen second-hand tanks wouldn't immediately win the war against Putin's hordes. That's not to say that Western tanks didn't help or weren't decisive, they absolutely were. Everywhere that Western tanks showed up, Russian tanks immediately became a federally protected endangered species. Western infantry fighting vehicles were also significantly decisive in engagements against their Russian counterparts, as has been seen in countless clips from the fighting, while the BMP runs the Bradley hunts. And when Western vehicles were defeated, their crews didn't immediately join the Ukraine space program the way Russian tank crews have historically been promoted to cosmonauts. Instead, Ukrainian crews survived their vehicle's destruction and lived to fight another day. But superior as Western equipment may be, it's incapable of winning a war in the pithy sums supplied to Ukraine. Even worse, to date, there's been no plan to actually replace these tanks with ongoing resupply. This leaves Ukraine in the impossible position of having to plan out military operations where it has no guarantee of actually replacing the equipment it loses in combat, which means the nation is forced to hoard its resources out of fear that it may not receive replacements. That is not a smart way to wage war. Now F-16s are on their way to Ukraine, and much hype is being made about their entry into the war. Like Western tanks and IFVs, though, there is also no plan in place to replenish Ukrainian losses and continue supply of jets over the long term. Like Western tanks, F-16s will make a splash wherever they appear, but will ultimately be too few in number to significantly affect the outcome of the fighting. This mirrors perfectly the entry of long-range strike missiles into the Ukrainian arsenal. Storm Shadow and ATACMS made a hell of a showing when they entered the war, with Ukraine granting an early retirement to several Russian Black Sea Fleet senior officers in just one Storm Shadow attack. Likewise, ATACMS turned multiple Russian attack helicopters to Swiss cheese in its debut attack, and has on multiple times permanently denazified entire formations of Russian soldiers far behind the front lines. But within months of their entry into the war, the strikes stopped because the weapons ran out. And you guessed it, there was no plan for Ukraine to actually get more. Britain itself was already in dangerously low supply of Storm Shadows due to significantly underestimating the threat of major conventional war and criminal underinvestment in its military, a casualty of the post-Cold War peace dividend shared by most powers in the West. The United States balked over and over again about providing ATACMS out of fear that they'd be used inside of Russia itself. And to be completely fair, it's the only nation with a legitimate need for its own stockpile of missiles, as ATACMS could play an important role in the Pacific conflict against China. France stepped up to the plate and began to provide its own Scalp missiles to complement delivery of Storm Shadow, and Macron has recently announced the transfer of 40 more Scalp along with hundreds of other aerial bombs. However, Olaf Scholz refused to provide Germany's Taurus missile, despite pressure from across NATO, fearful of escalation, despite there being no escalation to either Storm Shadow, ATACMS, or any of the dozens of other weapons given to Ukraine in 2 years of fighting. Backlash against Scholz, yet again balking at providing war-winning weapons, has escalated to the point that German legislators are investigating ways of providing the weapons in a way that bypasses Scholz. The West and wider world beyond is slowly waking up to the very real threat that Russia poses, not just in Ukraine but beyond. But other than the West's criminal neglect in handling the Russian threat, how is Russia gearing up to challenge Europe? The first factor is Russia's ability to adapt to a war that it was losing up until relatively recently. Russia has increasingly attempted to emulate the West's military culture that places a high priority on individual initiative, without much success. This has left the Russian military still operating under a Soviet-style top-down command structure with little room for subordinates to act of their own accord. This has been especially true after the Wagner coup, where Russian military leaders have increasingly been promoted more for their loyalty than their actual experience or capability. These are all bad things, but the good thing for Russia is that its military has proven adaptable to the many strategic and tactical failures of its past. The Russian military, for example, no longer operates tanks and armored vehicles in large formations during assaults, which we saw repeatedly decimated across the first half of 2023 and all of 2022. Instead, it's opted for smaller-scale tactics, often sending assaults out in small groups of unsupported infantry, which identify and fix Ukrainian positions for artillery to the pound. Rather than sending in a large contingent of vehicles to reinforce the attack, instead we've seen far smaller scales of attacks of BMPs and tanks, limiting losses to Ukrainian artillery and drones. This actually exploits Ukraine's shell shortage, as the UAF is loath to expend its remaining stockpile of artillery shells on small targets. Next, Russia has offered increasingly lucrative pay packages to new recruits willing to serve in Ukraine. When the conflict started, junior officers made about 81,000 rubles a month, or $900, far below rates in Western militaries. However, 6 months later, junior troops who enlisted could earn as much as 195,000 rubles a month, or $2,100. Other perks include grocery and housing allowances, things that are typically standard in the U.S. military. In some cases, Russia even offered as much as 1 million rubles or $11,000 as an enlistment bonus for its, quote, elite divisions. These recruitment packages are incredibly attractive to Russians living in the nation's poorest oblasts, with an estimated 13.5 million Russians living below the poverty line. According to Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, these incentives have generated, quote, 2 combined armies, a mixed aviation corps, and 50 new formations and military units, including 4 divisions, 18 brigades, and 28 regiments. Of course, Shoigu is a lying sack of shih tzus, so his figures should be taken with a grain of salt. Though given the dramatic expansion of the Russian military, they're also not entirely imaginary, as most Russian claims often are. Then there's the mobilization of the Russian industry, which has now been officially put on a war footing. This more than anything accounts for Russia's growing successes in Ukraine, because while Russian equipment may be garbage, it's generating enough to drown Ukrainian defenders in a tidal wave of it. In 2024, Russian defense spending doubled to 7.1% of GDP, a figure similar to the famous arms buildup of the United States in the 1980s, when America beat the Soviet Union at the Cold War by simply outspending it. Defense spending will account for about 35% of the total budget, and industries directly supporting the war are experiencing unprecedented growth. production of transportation vehicles rose 66.7% in 2023, and computer and electronics manufacturing rose 42.6%, indicating that Russia is still able to procure badly needed microchips, despite international bans thanks to China. Navigation devices rose 72.4%, and protective clothing rose by 40.4%. At arms factories across the nation, production is now run 24 hours a day, and a new government committee has been established to oversee defense production. This committee has absolute power over Russian industry, even capable of taking over a company's budget entirely and forcing the cancellation of vacation or time-off requests by workers. If there is a bright spot in all this, it's that the Russian industry is significantly less efficient than it was pre-war, thanks to a combination of sanctions and the pullout of Western businesses and investments. Russia lacks the investments and technical expertise to maintain or replace some of its high-technology assets, forcing it to rely on more inefficient but locally produced alternatives. This is hitting the Russian energy sector especially hard, as Russian oil companies were extremely reliant on Western technology inside of their refineries. Hardest hit has been natural gas, with Russia not having the technology to liquefy natural gas, a growing concern as Ukrainian drone strikes increasingly target LNG terminals and other refineries rather than actual oil extraction sites. But the reshaping of the Russian economy paints a dire picture. As the West continues to hem and haw over every single bullet sent to Ukraine, Russia is pumping out equipment at a frightening rate. It claims to have received 1,500 new and modernized tanks after tripling vehicle generation rates in 2023. Yet it's impossible to know how many of these are new and how many are simply refurbished vehicles pulled out of deep storage. We know those stores are beginning to run out, and what's left is unlikely to be of much use. Already, there's evidence that Russia is ripping the turrets out of T-55s and using them as armored personnel carriers instead. While estimates vary, a modest figure of 200 new tanks a year seems reasonable, and as the numbers of tanks held in deep storage runs out, those factories will instead be free to convert over to producing new tanks. In artillery shells, Russia has absolutely dwarfed the West, with estimates of 250,000 new shells being produced a month, in addition to an unknown number of shells purchased from North Korea. This puts Russia on track to produce 3 million shells a year, while the US is expanding its own production capabilities to hit 100,000 shells a month by 2025. Though this effort has been stalled due to Speaker Mike Johnson refusing to allow a vote on the Ukrainian aid bill. Of the 1 million shells promised to Ukraine by the EU in 2023, just over half of that was ultimately delivered. There are efforts to purchase 1 million shells from abroad, but that doesn't fix the dearth in production by the West, and Russia has a massive head start on production. The results are evident on the battlefield. Despite a successful and vigorous campaign against Russian artillery by Ukraine that saw the UAF achieve shell parity or even superiority across parts of the front, we're now back to the old days. Russia is once more firing 10 times as many shells as Ukraine, with direct battlefield effects. All across the front, the lack of shells is leading to slow but incremental victories by Russian forces. Russia has also begun to produce drones in vast numbers. At the start of the war, Russian forces were completely unprepared for the onslaught of Ukrainian drones. Yet now Ukrainian forces are reporting not just a parity in drones, but an overmatch in some areas. Iranian-made Shahed kamikaze drones are now being produced domestically with Iranian help, and it's converting civilian drone industry to military use. Inspection of crashed Russian drones has revealed Swiss, American, and Chinese components, leading the West to attempt to tighten export controls. Yet most of these components are easily available in civilian products. And while this limits the effectiveness of Russian drones, the sheer quantity of them is a quality all its own. While drone attacks against civilian and infrastructure targets were originally only carried out by a small number of drones, as recently as January, the Ukrainians report shooting down as many as 35 Shahed drones in a single attack. Leaked internal Russian documents showed that the nation plans on expanding production to 6,000 kamikaze drones by 2025, though this plan comes with a hitch. These drones rely overwhelmingly on Western components from the US, Germany, Switzerland, and other Western nations, and an effort to stop or curb secondhand sales outside of the EU and North America could put a serious crimp in those plans. Yet, as usual, the goal of 6,000 drones a month hints at Russia's willingness to pursue this campaign past Ukraine. It's not a simple matter to mobilize a nation's industry and then just wind it down. Switching from civilian to military production is a sizable investment in resources, and one you only make if you're expecting to continue producing military equipment in the long run. Simply put, Russia has opened the floodgate, and after weathering intense Western sanctions, it has little reason to simply close it up again. If anything, Russia has gotten tacit approval from the West itself to continue its campaign in Ukraine and beyond it as well. Putin has proven that the West is largely disorganized and, despite proclamations of unity, is anything but. Each new major weapon delivery prompts fierce debate amongst Western leaders, and after 2 years of fighting, NATO has yet to commit to Ukrainian victory. Even worse, as Russian industry mobilizes, Western efforts to match it sputter and struggle to gain traction. Western gear may be superior, but that matters little when it's drowned out by overwhelming numbers of Russian kit. NATO has shown that it lacks the backbone to challenge Russia directly, and Putin's indirect threats of nuclear weapons have been sufficient to deter the West. Facing a disorganized, reluctant, and unprepared West, Putin has every reason to believe he could win a war of attrition against NATO's eastern flank. This puts the Baltics and even Poland directly in the firing line, and Russia has for years wanted to force the Baltics back into its sphere of influence and close the Suwalki Gap. There's even reason to fear that Russia would attack Finland as well, as a way of punishing it for joining the NATO alliance, but even more insidiously, to prove that NATO's Article 5 commitment is a farce. This has been a NATO fear for decades, even before the war in Ukraine. During his presidency, US President Barack Obama warned of a fait accompli attack into the Baltics by Russia, with the nation seizing part or the entirety of a Baltic state and then digging in the defensive. Russia gambled then and today that NATO would fear escalation to a nuclear conflict too much to actually honor its Article 5 commitment, and the war in Ukraine has proven that he's probably right about that. If Article 5 fails, the NATO alliance would lose all credibility and quickly fall apart, reverting Europe back to a pre-World War II state of insecurity. It would also open the door to Russia reclaiming the Soviet territories it lost at the end of the Cold War, a stated goal of Vladimir Putin and his administration. For years, this has seemed far-fetched, and yet, it's not just NATO's failure in Ukraine that's making this possible, it's the possible loss or at least non-commitment of NATO's most important member, the United States. As its largest military power, the US underpins NATO's security, and indeed is the logistical backbone that would get much of NATO's forces into the fight. Yet America's commitment to NATO has become questionable at best, sparking a panic in Europe. Federal defendant Donald Trump has publicly stated that he would not allow but actually encourage Russia to attack NATO states that he felt weren't, quote, paying their dues. No American president has ever undermined the NATO alliance this way, let alone actively encouraged a hostile foreign power to attack America's allies. Yet, Trump harbors other Putin sympathies that has alarmed many in Europe and in the US, and in the past threatened to pull the US out of the alliance. Now it's his arm of the Republican Party, the MAGA Alliance, which is actively blocking badly needed Ukraine aid, and has done so for months. Despite a bipartisan agreement to fund both Ukraine aid and border security, the most robust border security bill in history, and one endorsed by the National Border Patrol Council, Speaker and Trump ally Mike Johnson has refused for months to allow the bill to come to a vote. Leaving NATO would require congressional approval, and yet Trump has placed himself in position to gain the support that he needs should Republicans control the Senate. Fear of upsetting MAGA supporters has prompted many otherwise moderate Republicans to toe the party line, and with the appointment of Laura Trump to the Republican National Convention, the MAGA bloc has significant power to empower the election of MAGA-friendly Republicans. This has opened the door to a Trump presidential win in 2024, with Trump publicly stating that he would not support Ukraine any further. While loyalists paint this as an attempt to enact a peace settlement, Europe is in an increasing state of alarm over what a Russian takeover of Ukraine would entail, and what would come next as Russian industry has been fully mobilized for war. The writing is on the wall, and Europe must empower Ukraine to fight Russia today and do it itself in a few short years, potentially even without US support. Many people think overpopulation is the biggest threat the human race will face in the future, but this is not true. The biggest problem of the future is actually population decline. In a world where the population in a country decreases rapidly, economies will crash, aging citizens won't be able to get the help they need, and progress will stall. You might be thinking, aren't there already too many people on the planet using too many resources? Or wouldn't a smaller population be better for everyone? The answer to this and your other burning questions are all about to be answered. First, let's be clear. Humans are not in danger of overpopulating the planet. There are vast amounts of resources, and although they're limited, we likely could never reach the carrying capacity of Earth. Instead, the real problem is that people living in wealthier nations consume much more resources than they should. It's overconsumption that's driving the current problems of climate change and resource loss. Even still, you would assume less people would equal less consumption, and therefore population decline could be a good thing. But this is not necessarily the case. To better understand the ramifications of population decline in a country, we must first examine what causes it, why it's harmful, and which countries are in the most danger because of it. There are several nations whose populations are already in decline. However, even in countries that are still currently growing, most will begin to stagnate in the near future as birth rates decrease. This is one of the key reasons why populations are starting to fall around the world. Over the last couple of decades, women have been choosing to have fewer children or to start families later in life. As birth rates and the number of children in a family decline, the population also declines as older generations pass away. However, there are other ways that a country's population can decline even if birth rates exceed death rates. For example, in countries like Venezuela, birth rates are still high, but immigration rates are causing a decline in the country's population. Due to the economic crisis and harsh living conditions, more and more Venezuelans are leaving for a better life outside their home country. This happens in many other places around the world, and it's a combination of declining birth rates and high immigration rates that can cause populations to rapidly decrease. The causes of a population decline have a large effect on a country itself. Unfortunately, even though there are several pros to a decreasing population, such as more space for native habitats to regrow and less strain on natural resources, there are many cons as well. Let's discuss the repercussions a country faces when it can find itself with a dwindling population size. The scariest part of this whole thing is that most countries in Europe, Asia, and much of the Americas are about to experience these phenomena. The main concern for many countries is that a declining population can have drastic consequences on their economy. Less young people means less workers are entering the workforce every year. This is a huge problem because as older generations retire, there are fewer and fewer people to take their place. A shrinking labor pool inevitably leads to a decrease in economic growth. If a country doesn't have enough workers for entry-level jobs, entire businesses come crumbling to the ground. A huge economic burden is placed on those who are working, as they need to pick up the slack of the increasing number of retirees. The working class is forced to put in ever-increasing amounts of money to social services to ensure that older generations receive the support they need, while also having access to programs such as Social Security that provide them with some form of income. Another economic problem that occurs as a population grows older is that retired individuals tend to spend less money. This slows the economy even more in countries with shrinking populations, because their overall consumer base is buying fewer products and spending less money. Without young people to pick up the consumer slack, a country's economy once again begins to shrink. And this is not just a hypothetical situation. In 2016, Heilongjiang Province in northeastern China became the first municipality to run out of money in its pension system. The population in the region had been steadily declining, and more people were retiring than entering the workforce. At the moment, there just aren't enough workers to fund the pension system for the older generation. This might become the norm across the world in countries that rely on workers paying into Social Security and other unsustainable systems that were set up on the premise of an ever-growing workforce. This lack of young laborers causes other problems as well. When there's a shortage of cheap labor, wages tend to increase as the demand for employees increases. This might seem like a good thing at first, but it actually can hurt an economy. As young, unskilled laborers that would normally take entry-level jobs become more scarce, companies begin moving their operations to countries with cheaper labor pools to keep costs low. In parts of the world like Europe and Japan, this is becoming more and more common. But there's a much bigger problem with having a shortage of young people in an economy. It's the younger generations that tend to drive innovation. The fresh minds and dreams of young business people coming out of school and into the workplace are what drive change. Young entrepreneurs disrupt the status quo, which helps economies innovate and grow. However, with graduating classes of skilled students becoming smaller and smaller due to the shrinking populations, the innovators that drive progress are becoming few and far between. There's also a crazy and unexpected phenomenon happening in the countries that experience population decline. Depending on who you are, you may or may not agree with how the government is running your country. For younger generations, it feels like it's becoming more and more difficult to make progress, and part of that is due to population decline. In many European countries and even the United States, there are more older voters than young ones. This means that the political majority is in favor of the older, often more conservative voters. This is not because a country as a whole desires to be more conservative, but because older generations that tend to be set in their ways have a larger voter base than younger, more liberal voters. These shifts can have huge ramifications for progressive policies, such as combating climate change, increasing equality, and providing better social services. But the economy and political system are not the only parts of a country affected by population decline. The distribution of where people live can also shift. In most countries, cities continue to grow, even as the population declines. This is because cities tend to have more jobs and opportunities, even when economies are shrinking. As more and more people flock to cities, rural areas become ghost towns. Entire town centers, including schools, shops, and homes, are becoming abandoned as populations decline. Nature slowly takes back these areas, and in some places like Germany, abandoned buildings are torn down and replaced by parks and green spaces. This is definitely a good way to repurpose these areas, but the problem is that people who once lived in these towns and have moved are now putting greater pressure on the infrastructure, housing, and services of major cities. While the country as a whole might experience population decline, cities are seeing more and more growth. This is quite the conundrum, and one problem that desperately needs to be addressed by governments. With more people in urban centers, there's a greater need for investments in public transportation, sanitation, and emergency services. And as a reminder, all of these things tend to be paid for by taxpayers. As the working class becomes smaller, there will be less available income to tax, which will make funding vital services even more difficult than it already is. The sad reality is that in some countries, people are being asked to come out of retirement and work longer. In others, people don't have a choice and must keep working well past the age that they had initially planned to retire just to make ends meet. Germany has raised the retirement age to 67 and has plans to bump it up to 69 in the near future. At this rate, citizens of countries experiencing population decline may be working for their entire lives. So now you're probably wondering where population decline is the highest and how much it will affect you in the future. Eastern Europe contains the majority of countries that are predicted to experience severe population decline in the next 30 years. Several factors affect this region, many having to do with living conditions and political strife after the fall of the Soviet Union. This has led to low birth rates and high emigration rates, a combination that has drastic consequences on a population. Bulgaria is currently expected to lose 22.5% of its overall population by 2050. This means that the country's population will decline by almost a quarter in the next 30 years, from 6.9 million people to 5.4 million. This is a huge drop in population and will have drastic consequences for the country in the future. The largest contributing factor to Bulgaria's population decline is the migration of workers to countries with more job opportunities. The main group of people leaving the country are actually young and middle-aged workers that are so desperately needed to keep Bulgaria's economy from collapsing. The emigration of people from Bulgaria means that not only is its population getting smaller, but that the older generation will make up more of the overall population as the years go by. But Bulgaria isn't the only country experiencing this phenomenon. Latvia is expected to experience a 21.6% decline in population by 2050. This decrease is attributed to low birth rates and the migration of young workers to countries in the European Union with better opportunities. Latvia has been looked at as a clear indicator of what population decline can do to a country's economy. As fewer Latvians are entering the workforce and more citizens are seeking opportunities elsewhere, the Latvian economy has stalled and begun to decline. Again, this is to be expected as there are fewer workers and consumers every year, two things a struggling economy desperately needs to grow. Unfortunately, there are other factors outside the control of a country that can also lead to population decline, such as war. Perhaps there is no better example of this than in Ukraine. Before Putin decided to invade the country and start a war that has raged for what seems like an eternity, Ukraine's population was already in decline. Previous estimates projected that the Ukrainian population would shrink from 43.7 million people to 35.2 by 2050. This was because there were around 9.2 births for every 1,000 people in the country, while the death rate was approximately 15.2 deaths per 1,000. Obviously, this math paints a grim picture. Over 50% more people die each year than are born. This, coupled with migration out of the country for job opportunities, puts Ukraine in a dangerous position. However, with Russia's aggression and the war taking place on Ukrainian soil, the population decline in the country will be worse than anyone could have ever predicted. The obvious cause of the population decline currently happening in Ukraine is death due to combat or collateral damage. The United Nations estimates that somewhere around 14,200 to 14,400 Ukrainians have died in the conflict. At the same time, the decline is exacerbated by people seeking refuge in the surrounding nations to try to escape the carnage. Over 5 million people have fled the borders of Ukraine since the war began, and it's likely more will follow. Some will return home once the war ends, but many will start new lives in a different country. These displaced Ukrainians may visit their former home, but they'll probably never move back permanently. This is especially true for anyone who can set up a new life for themselves and their families in the country that they're currently seeking asylum in. The biggest threat to the future of Ukraine's population is that people are not having babies or starting families during this time for obvious reasons. The last thing on anyone's mind during a war is procreating. This means that while the war persists, birth rates will continue to decline. Even after the war ends, there will be a period of time where birth rates continue to decrease sharply until some form of normalcy is returned to the region. When looking at the rate of population decline worldwide, it's clear that Eastern Europe is in a bad spot. However, as can be seen, several other countries outside of Eastern Europe seem to be facing a decrease in population as well. Japan is an economic powerhouse. It has the third highest GDP in the world, behind the United States and China. But Japan faces a huge crisis. Its population is in decline, which is bound to cause an economic shockwave that will rock the island nation. By 2050, Japan's population is predicted to fall by 16.3%. This is due to very low fertility rates at an average of 1.42 births per woman. This is well below the 2.1 births per woman needed to keep a population stable. What this means is that in the coming years, Japan's overall population will be made up of mostly older individuals, with fewer and fewer young workers to take their place and support the economy. As Japan's population and economy shrink, the effects will be felt across the world. Japanese companies will not be able to produce as many products, and innovation will slow down due to a smaller number of young people entering the workforce each year. This will also mean that Japan will consume fewer goods, and therefore their imports will also decrease. Since Japan has such a large GDP, its population decline is not just a problem for the country but for its trade partners as well. Japan exports a massive amount of cars, circuitry, and other types of technology across the world, which will all come to a screeching halt if it doesn't find a way to boost its population. Japan is not the exception either. They just happen to be experiencing population decline at this very moment. Other countries will follow. In fact, many demographers and population scientists agree that the global population will stop increasing around the year 2100. Population growth is already beginning to slow in countries like China, the United States, and most of Europe. It'll not be long until these countries find themselves in the same predicament that Japan is currently facing. This brings us to the simple reason why population decline is happening in certain countries. Yes, a lot of it has to do with low birth rates, but why are birth rates falling in certain nations? The answer is twofold. Firstly, women have greater access to education and therefore more job opportunities. We still have a long way to go on the quest for equality, but strides have been made. Study after study shows that when women have access to education, birth rates decline. There are a few reasons for this. The first is that educated women can pursue careers and therefore put off having children until they've accomplished their goals. When this happens, women tend to wait until they're older to start a family and as a result, have fewer kids. Education for women is not universal around the world, and more often than not, countries that do not provide quality education for their female citizens tend to have higher birth rates. There are definitely other factors that play a role in these statistics, but all evidence points to the fact that the more educational opportunities women have, the less children they have on average. The second factor that's causing a decrease in birth rates is advances in healthcare. There are many more options for people who want to have sex but do not want to have babies than in the past. Contraceptives, birth control are now more widely available than ever before. That being said, not every country provides these services, and where they're in short supply, birth rates tend to be high. This is unsurprising, but brings up an interesting point. As more and more countries advance in healthcare and gain access to family planning resources, birth rates will continue to decrease. Obviously, these advances can be hindered in parts of the world that see contraceptives as being evil, or in regions that don't believe in giving women the right to choose what to do with their own bodies. However, an increase in education and advancement in healthcare are the main factors causing people to start families later in life, and as a result have fewer children. You might be asking yourself, is this a bad thing? Absolutely not, but it does explain why certain countries are experiencing population decline. Take the United States, for example. The US is not losing its population to mass migration. It's seen as the land of opportunity and a melting pot where people from cultures around the world can come together and work in harmony. This is not always what life is actually like in the United States, especially for certain immigrants and disenfranchised people. But there is no doubt that the US has a strong economy and there are opportunities. However, the birth rate in the country is dropping. In recent years, the birth rate has declined from 2 births per woman to 1.7 births per woman. This is below what's necessary to maintain a stable population, which means the United States will experience a population decline in the coming years unless something changes. Within the next decade, population growth will stagnate in the US. At that point, it's only a matter of time before the country's population begins to decline. Economists are now worried that when this happens, there will be a disastrous shortage of young laborers entering the workforce. Also, there will be fewer high school graduates, which could send educational institutions such as colleges and universities crumbling to the ground, as there won't be enough enrollment to keep them all open. However, there is a silver lining. Even though birth rates are declining, many believe the U.S. population will continue to grow steadily. But there's only one way this could happen. Population scientists are banking on the United States allowing more immigrants into the country. As immigration increases, population and the amount of young workers entering the workforce also increases. This is especially true if immigrants are allowed to make the U.S. their home and start their own families within its borders. As a result, increased immigration can offset the low birth rates in the country. That being said, if politicians put roadblocks in place to make immigration more difficult, immigrants will take their skills and families elsewhere. Therefore, it'd be beneficial for everyone in the United States to allow more people into its borders. This will boost the economy and also solve the problem of population decline. Oh, the irony. The bottom line is that birth rates in the United States are on the decline and likely will continue on that trend due to the availability of education for women and relatively easy access to birth control in the country. Therefore, the only way the U.S. can avoid drastic declines in its population and all the problems that go along with it is by welcoming more immigrants into its borders. This is true for any country experiencing population decline that can also provide economic opportunities for immigrants. European countries, Japan, and eventually other countries such as China will need to rethink their immigration policies if they want to continue their economic growth. To make this even more blatantly clear, we can look at South Korea as a case study. Like many countries, South Korea is starting to see its population stagnate and decline. To combat this problem, South Korea invested billions of dollars into programs to encourage its citizens to have more babies. The government increased child allowances and medical subsidies for fertility treatments. They covered buses and subway cars with advertisements to encourage people to start a family, while also installing pink seats on public transportation that are reserved for pregnant women. To show their commitment to the cause, the South Korean government also built hundreds of kindergartens and daycare centers to provide families with the resources they need to have kids while also advancing their careers. All in all, South Korea spent $178 billion over the past 15 years to encourage women to have more children. Even still, the deputy prime minister of the country said there just was not enough progress being made, and South Korea would still begin to experience population decline in the near future. This is a warning for countries that think they can combat population decline without opening their borders to immigrants. It just can't be done. Having a baby is expensive. Having multiple children is even more expensive. This is why many people are moving away from having large families. It's not because they don't want to have multiple kids, it's just that they can't afford it. This fact, coupled with an increase in education and birth control, are the main reasons many countries with strong economies will experience population decline at some point in the next century. For countries that are struggling economically, it's the combination of mass emigration and low birth rates that will drive their populations down. The war in Ukraine has brought industrialized warfare back to Europe for the first time since World War II. While this isn't the only recent conflict in Eastern Europe, those were small skirmishes in comparison to the titanic amount of resources and manpower being levied by both Russia and Ukraine. This is more than just a clash between two nations, though, as a significant amount of the NATO alliance has thrown its weight into the mix. This is a clash between two major powers, Russia and the West. To date, NATO has not formally joined the war but has done a lot to support Ukraine's ability to fight off the Russian invasion, and even reversing the tide of the war. When the war started, Ukrainian troops were moderately armed and equipped, and the nation had no hope of properly equipping the hundreds of thousands of conscripts and volunteers that were drawn up after full mobilization. NATO quickly began to ship badly needed personal equipment, such as helmets, body armor, and even uniforms. Today, the average Ukrainian infantryman is far better equipped than his Russian counterpart, all thanks to Western support. The United States specifically has done practically everything to fight off the Russian invasion, except pull the trigger itself on the weapons it supplies to Ukraine. The vast arsenal of American reconnaissance and surveillance assets, as well as its huge intelligence apparatus, has been brought to bear on Russian forces with titanic consequences. Russian generals and senior officers are dying at an alarming rate, thanks to U.S. intelligence and recon provided directly to Ukrainian forces on the ground via intelligence sharing networks. American generals even famously rejected the original Ukrainian September offensive plans and reshaped them in collaboration with their Ukrainian counterparts, leading to one of the most stunning defeats of Russian forces since the Russo-Japanese War. But the war in Ukraine has shown the world just how poorly prepared countries are for the return of industrial warfare, and France, along with other nations, are quickly taking note. The most striking lesson from the war in Ukraine is that Russia is nowhere near the military power it pretended to be. The second most striking lesson is that modern war against a near-peer adversary eats up resources at truly astonishing rates. Russian artillery is using up on average of 20,000 rounds of artillery a day, with a monthly average of 600,000. While most Western powers keep reserve ammunition in the millions of units, this still means that with current stockpiles, even a power like the United States can only undertake a couple months of high-intensity combat operations before they have to start being very judicious on their usage of artillery. And that's exactly the opposite of how artillery is meant to be used. To date, Russia has lost over 1,000 tanks in the fighting, with that number spiking dramatically during the current counteroffensive by Ukraine. During this ongoing counteroffensive, Russia is estimated to be losing 10 tanks a day, an astonishing figure only made more astonishing by the fact that half these tanks are being abandoned. Ukraine, on the other hand, is losing 2 a day. Still a very worrying figure for any military power, as losing 60 tanks in 1 month would be a significant number of losses for most armies. France, for instance, has just over 500 tanks, so this rate of loss would equal 12% of its tank forces every month, a completely unsustainable figure without some form of rapid replenishment. If France was losing tanks at the rate Russia is losing them, they'd be losing 20% of their force every month, going from unsustainable levels to catastrophic levels. For Ukraine, it helps that most former Russian tanks are now current Ukrainian tanks, as it's estimated that half the losses inflicted on Russia are being either captured or repaired by Ukrainians and put back into service on their side. When you become your enemy's primary supplier of heavy equipment, you're not en route to win a war, but you are at least making it very sustainable for them to continue fighting. That's unlikely to be the case for nations like France if they were to return to a state of industrialized warfare, which is why nations like France, the United States, and Germany are taking long, hard looks at their plans for high-intensity conflict and making preparations for sustainment of high-technology fighting forces over the long term. Preparing for high-intensity war means fielding forces that are capable of achieving victory in a high-tech future, and that's why France is currently in the middle of a 20-year modernization program named Scorpion. The program is meant to last through 2040, bringing France's military, already one of the most capable, if not the most capable in Europe, up to the cutting edge, with modern forces fighting with modern weapons and using modern doctrine. For this initiative, France has taken a page out of the US playbook. No surprise, seeing as there is heavy collaboration between the two nations in this and most other military matters. Currently, France's focus is on upgrading its light and medium tank forces to bring them up to a modern standard of battlefield connectivity. In the 1990s, the US delivered a shocking defeat to Iraq with absurdly low losses on its behalf, thanks to a slew of modern technologies. But the most important of these technologies was the ability for the US forces to communicate and share data amongst themselves. In the modern battlefield, data is king, and the US has since then expended vast amounts of resources on what it calls Joint All-Domain Command and Control. This is a web of systems that networks US forces together so that all sensors and shooters can freely talk to each other. The best example of this doctrine came during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. On the push to Baghdad, a single platoon of US Marines, performing recon ahead of an armored advance, ran into a significant Iraqi tank force. The Marines were equipped with heavy machine guns and a few tow missiles fired from unarmored Humvees. In theory, the Americans were utter and complete toast. Unknown to the Iraqi commander, who eagerly ordered his forces to attack, the Marines were in direct communication with loitering aircraft, and within moments of spotting the Iraqi force advancing on them, they placed a call for fire support. A B-52 answered the call and, using targeting data from the Marines, was able to locate the rapidly advancing Iraqi armor. The B-52 dropped 6 CBU-105 cluster bombs, a smart weapon capable of dispensing submunitions over hundreds of meters, with each submunition then being capable of identifying and targeting its own enemy vehicle. In one bombing run, the bulk of the Iraqi force was decimated, causing the rest to quickly retreat. The defeat of an entire Iraqi armored column by an infantry platoon may be one of the most lopsided victories in history. That is the power of data sharing, and it's the type of capability that France is looking to bring to all of its ground forces. Under the name of Combined Collaborative Combat, France is undertaking a series of upgrades to help its lighter tank forces be more accurate, nimble, and have greater battlespace awareness. However, there's a number of equipment upgrades also coming, or already being deployed by the French forces, one of the most significant hardware upgrades by any modern military power. The first of these is the EBRC Jaguar, a replacement for the 40-year-old AMX-10RC and ERC-90 Sagae. The Jaguar will look to take on both the recon and fire support roles for infantry forces from its predecessors, bringing logistical simplicity and increased capabilities to a modern force. But the upgrades to armor and its 40mm cannon are only the start. Because this vehicle is meant to be cheap yet capable and easy to replace in high-intensity conflict, the vehicle's manufacturer is contractually obligated to keep the cost of each vehicle under 1 million euros. So the vehicle is based on a 6x6 commercial all-terrain truck chassis, which includes using commercial truck engines. In case of a protracted war, this is a vehicle that's not only capable and cheap, but also extremely easy to keep building, as it required little specialized tools or knowledge and uses widely available commercial parts. By comparison, the American Stryker costs nearly $5 million per unit. While you're getting significantly more capability for the price, it also means that replacing Strykers lost to wartime attrition is not only more costly, but more time-consuming. The vehicle does use many parts common to U.S. Army trucks, making logistics easier, but it doesn't enjoy the same commercial availability of parts or even a basic chassis as the Jaguar does. French infantry will also be seeing an upgrade to the VBMR Griffin armored personnel carrier, replacing the VAB its troops have been using since 1976. Once more, the vehicle is based on the same 6x6 commercial truck chassis, making production and maintenance easier in times of war. France has plans to buy nearly 2,000 of them to fully replace its fleet of VABs. Already we see 2 ways France may be better prepared for a protracted high-intensity war than the US. The Stryker is a truly impressive vehicle, but it relies on specialized defense contractors to build. French infantry support vehicles may be less capable, but they are far cheaper and easier to produce given the wide availability of their commercial parts. Considering that the entire world has seen a shrinking and consolidation of their defense industry sectors since the end of the Cold War, being able to source your fighting vehicles from commercial sources is a significant advantage. Strykers may be able to perform better but will attrit quickly, and the US will be hard-pressed to replace combat losses until years into a war when manufacturing is finally spun up to its full potential. Meanwhile, French forces will enjoy far more rapid replenishment of forces despite a sacrifice on capability. Scorpion is only the start though, with the next phase of French build-up projected to start in 2030. Named Titan, this phase of France's modernization program is aimed at its heavy combat forces, things such as artillery, tanks, and helicopters. The early focus on lighter weapon systems is understandable, as France already enjoys very capable main battle tanks, attack helicopters, and artillery. But the delay is also pragmatic. France plans to begin Titan with an in-depth study of projected force needs even before a single replacement vehicle is procured. The reasoning is simple. Nobody has any idea what the future of war is going to look like. Militaries constantly make very educated guesses and carefully observe global trends, making adjustments as necessary, but with technology leading to capability leapfrogs, it's difficult to know what the future threat environment is going to look like. Add to this the very worrying trend of rapidly converting off-the-shelf commercial equipment into unconventional weapons of war, and a future combat environment may look like nothing that any power has currently predicted. Few, if any, observers could have guessed that during the opening days of the Ukraine war, commercial drones would become the conflict's defining feature, and one of the keys to Ukraine's victories over a far numerically superior foe. France and other powers expect that the future will be one fraught with anti-access air denial systems where no battle domain will be truly uncontested. This will include traditional A2AD threats such as kinetic kill systems involving artillery, suicide drones, and mines, but also threats in the space and cyber realms. Electromagnetic weapons such as the US's EM missile, capable of shutting down electronics in a specified area, will require not just one but a network of solutions to ensure friendly forces can fight and win the day. As the A2AD threat environment continues to evolve, forces will require an onion-like layer of defenses, necessitating connectivity, situational awareness, and the ability to rapidly react to a variety of threats, often simultaneously. To this end, France's push to network its forces is a solid step forward. Lessons from Ukraine have also told French observers that infantry mobility and awareness is crucial to victory, and here too France is well on its way to meeting the challenges of tomorrow. What remains unknown is the fate of heavy combat systems. In Ukraine, we've seen Russian tanks taken out by cheap commercial drones, armed with nothing more than just grenades or mortars, and man-portable air defense systems have made the use of Russian aviation on the front lines an incredibly risky proposition. Figuring out how to defeat ever smaller, more portable, and harder to detect threats will shape the way that heavy combat vehicles are designed, used, and deployed in combat. However, one key deficiency highlighted by French analysts is that its forces lacked serious depth. Geared toward fighting fast, mobile skirmishes in sub-Saharan Africa, French forces would struggle in a high-intensity conflict such as that in Ukraine. To that end, France is looking to build up its combat forces, but like many other Western powers is also taking a serious look at how to ensure its defense industry can stand up to the challenge of quick and long-term resupply of combat losses. Here it joins the United States and Germany who have also both identified serious deficiencies in their ability to manufacture large amounts of heavy equipment. In the US alone, hundreds of factories were shut down at the end of the Cold War, and US tank production today stands at about 60 vehicles a year. In war, it's estimated this number could be ramped up to 20 a month, but this would hardly put a dent in potential losses against a near-peer foe. How France and its friends respond to these challenges may decide today if Western allies win the wars of tomorrow. But for the first time in 30 years, the Western world is once more preparing itself to wage global wars. For the last 50-plus years, countries' primary shows of power relied on the strength of one's material output, weapons that far exceeded the strengths or capabilities of flesh and bone exclusively. Soon after splitting the atom in 1932, it was believed by some, at least in theory, that the use of men in uniform was merely a placeholder for things to come. In recent years, however, whether it be fear of a nuclear end or our inability to create sufficient robotic replacements, conflicts like the Russo-Ukraine War have proven the old ways, albeit far from ideal, are still an essential part of national defense. To clarify, the need for actual boots on the ground isn't just a basic need, but one growing in significance, more than at any other time in recorded history. A shocking turn of events, considering what everyone was told just a few years ago. Forced drafts and invasive recruitment strategies were becoming a retired practice in many countries. This was based on the belief that such a requirement was now an archaic practice to be buried and forgotten. And yet, sources now reveal, after most EU countries abandoned conscription between 2000 and 2010, a growing number are considering a change in course. These sentiments have become very real in just a handful of months, and now the world is finally taking notice. But this has not come about without some historical precedent. The lasting post-war peace that is seen in Western Europe today, when held up to how the continent behaved prior to the Cold War, is nothing short of miraculous. Outside of short periods of tranquility, such as the decades following the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was arguably the most violent place to live on the planet. With rising aggregate influence in the form of leagues and states, the early 17th century saw a massive uptick in recruitment. Analysts are quick to point out that the discrepancy between the high aspirations of sovereigns and the brutal practice of largely mercenary soldiers gave the 30 Years' War a nightmarish character. It's important to point out that much of this turmoil had motivations stemming from religious disagreements. The three Christian organizations, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, and the Roman Catholics, used the message of creating a unified faith to galvanize foreign support. What had started as an isolated disagreement between the Roman Catholics and the Bohemians quickly morphed into a messy assortment of alliances that forced the hand of almost all of Europe, a trend that continues in modern warfare. What makes this global conflict different from all those that preceded it, though, to the point where referencing its conclusion has become a meme among history buffs, is how it transformed geopolitics forever. Nearing the end of the war, King Louis XIII of France started backing Protestant armies against the Habsburg Empire. This single decision removed religion from the main discussion. The message was clear: the future European order would be one that sought political dominance, not religious supremacy outside of its own borders. The 30 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which changed the map of Europe irrevocably. The territorial clauses all favored Sweden, France, and their allies. The resulting peace agreement recognized the full territorial sovereignty of the member states of the empire. They were empowered to contract treaties with one another and with foreign powers, provided that the emperor and the empire suffered no prejudice. By this and other changes, the princes of the empire became absolute sovereigns in their own dominions. Although the unity between church and state was stronger than ever before, it was no longer the casus belli for world dominance. Instead, mass conscription became a part of a nation's identity. With the collapse of the papal dominance over Europe, monarchs could educate and deploy their people any way they saw fit. Edicts generally did not require imperial approval, so countries now were able to build armies with little resistance. The rise of Napoleon proved that troops were more accessible than ever. Levies and slavery were now more of a last resort. With sufficient gravitas, it became clear that a single individual could summon an army rivaling ancient Rome, simply by changing legislation. As stated, amassing such a force before this point was much harder and often required clever diplomacy and funding. European conscription systems began to change in a big way by the late 18th century. If nations wished to recruit troops, it had to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, non-negotiable. Most of the men in Napoleon's Grande Armée were conscripts drawn from the poorer classes. Every able-bodied man of age in France was expected to willingly join the ranks to defend the Republic or risk losing citizenship. It's not like this was a new idea necessarily. One only needs to look at East Asia. At the start of the Han Dynasty, male commoners were liable for conscription starting from the age of 23 until the age of 56. However, this was relatively uncommon in places like Prussia, who were used to relying on superior organization and tactical factors such as order of battle to focus superior troops against inferior ones. Given approximately equivalent forces, as was generally the case with professional armies, these factors showed considerable importance. That would all change when the French draft model shattered their once formidable defense strategy. The effective Napoleonic recruitment tactic would set the tone for decades, with many states requiring preemptive training for all of its younger citizens. Prussia's shift after learning from previous mistakes would lead to a stunning reunification, forming the German Empire, or the Second Reich, lasting until 1918. In 1874, Russia introduced universal conscription in the modern pattern, an innovation only made possible by the abolition of serfdom in 1861. In the decades prior to World War I, universal conscription along broadly Prussian lines became the norm for European armies and those modeled on them. By 1914, the only substantial armies still completely dependent on voluntary enlistment were those of Britain and the United States. Some countries met the issue somewhere in the middle, such as the post-Napoleonic French method of conscripting armies for domestic stability, while professional units oversaw colonial security abroad. Pre-war assembly was not only a requirement for these European nations, but it slowly became a cultural rite of passage for able-bodied males. For most of the 20th century, this form of preparation was an honor and a privilege, only later to be superseded by a college degree. In some ways, this emphasis on martial bravery fueled a craving in some countries to once again change the established paradigm. A number of alliances involving European powers, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and other parties had existed for years, but political instability in the Balkans, particularly Bosnia, Serbia, and Herzegovina, threatened to destroy these agreements. The bubble finally burst, as many already know, in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was shot to death along with his wife Sophie by the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip on June 28, 1914. Europe once again had to look at their draft systems in preparation for war, one unlike anything anyone had ever seen. For countries like the US and the UK, their stance on voluntary enlistment during the First World War started off strong. America had little interest in putting boots to the ground. The chief task of the nation would be provide war materials, not men, for the Allies. Most Americans believed that raising a large army would divert the United States from its essential obligation and would thus do more harm than good. As the war heated up in 1915, President Woodrow Wilson recommended an increase of the regular army from 142,000 to 400,000 men, but Congress was extremely hesitant, believing this would be an unnecessary tax burden. Almost a year later, war was declared, and the armed forces had 378,619 men ready to fight. As for the British, the conflict was already well underway. Lord Kitchener's campaign, promoted by his famous "Your Country Needs You" poster, had encouraged over 1 million men to enlist by January 1915. That said, the initial losses eclipsed voluntary recruitment, and the country had no choice but to introduce conscription. By 1916, Britain's Military Service Act imposed conscription on all single men between the ages of 18 and 41, with a second act removing the exemption for married men as well. The age limit had also been raised to 51. The full period had raised 2.5 million men, and the U.S. quickly followed suit, with Congress passing the Selective Service Act, which Wilson signed into law on May 18, 1917. The act required all men in the U.S. between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for military service. Within a few months, some 10 million men across the country had registered in response to the military draft. By the end of World War I, 24 million were registered under Wilson's act. About 4.8 million ended up serving, of which 2.8 million were drafted. To reiterate, the rest of Europe had adopted a completely different philosophy. With a continent full of citizen soldiers, countries like Germany didn't hesitate to use this to their advantage. In Germany, at the age of 20, men would undertake 2 or 3 years of peacetime training in the active army. At the end of their training, they were allowed to go back into civilian life, but could be called back to the army at any time up to the age of 45. This made conscription an immediate option, and Germany only needed 12 days to raise their army from 800,000 to 3.5 million men, meaning that in Germany under 60% of military-aged men served. This initial speed proved to be devastating for the Allies, but Britain's naval blockade in the English Channel and the North Sea, with the assistance of Italy and France in the Atlantic, eventually choked the Germans into submission. Harsh weather conditions prevented the country from self-sustaining, and World War I officially came to an end in June 1919. In a startling turn of events, the developing West's draft policies would once again be challenged on September 1, 1939, when the Allies once again found themselves waging a war against a revivified Germany. Just a few years before the beginning of the Great War, Hitler, in direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, announced the German rearmament program in 1935. The army reached its projected goal of 36 divisions. During the autumn of 1937, 2 more corps were formed. In 1938, 4 additional corps were formed, with the inclusion of 5 divisions of the Austrian army after the Anschluss in March. Once again, Germany's swift conscription and deployment strategies knocked the enemy off its feet. This time, the output was far too great for the rest of Europe to handle. Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and France fell in just weeks, leaving the UK isolated on their small island across the Channel. During World War II, a total of about 13.6 million soldiers served in the German army. Army personnel were made up of volunteers and conscripts. The British needed to act quickly. There was no room for hesitation. This time, the British draft was far more aggressive. Conscientious objectors had to appear before a tribunal to argue their reasons for refusing to join up. If their cases were not dismissed, they were granted one of several categories of exemption and were given non-combatant jobs. The U.S. also changed its policies dramatically, starting the first peacetime draft in national history. They implemented a lottery system, and able-bodied men were required to serve at least 1 year in the armed forces. It would only intensify in the coming years, as once the U.S. entered World War II, draft terms extended through the duration of the fighting. By the end of the war in 1945, 50 million men between the ages of 18 and 45 had registered for the draft, and 10 million had been inducted into the military. Given the fact that the United States possessed a larger population, their conscription policy was a little more balanced. An example of this would be Executive Order 9279, which closed voluntary enlistment for all men between 18 to 37. However, the British National Service ended in 1960, while the U.S. military drafted 2.2 million American men out of an eligible pool of 27 million until 1973, when they were fighting a war with Vietnam. The US and the Soviet Union continued to focus on conscription during the Cold War, but the rest of Europe was busy licking their wounds. As each decade passed, the continued continental peace prompted many nations to question World War-level conscription. For a while, it started to look like an unnecessary burden on the taxpayer. By the early 2000s, politicians began promoting a message of neutrality. In recent years, most participants who chose slowly to dismantle their military programs are now starting to rethink these policy changes. As violence escalates between Russia and Ukraine, nations are once again calling to raise the banners in preparation for a new growing threat from the East. The UK military leadership, specifically figures like General Patrick Sanders, the Army's Chief of the General Staff, argued that the UK should form a citizen army in the event of open conflict between NATO and Russia. This pre-recruitment address has reintroduced a topic that few have broached in over 50 years. A handful of other military leaders, such as retired Colonel Tim Collins, have since vocally supported the proposition. Initially, the push to recruit more men seems presumptuous, and yet, when one thinks about how the UK's voluntary draft system has handicapped them in the past, it's hard to deny that more troops would be helpful if confronted with another large war. The UK has responded to the recent unrest, stating it has no plans to introduce conscription. So at least for now, that option has been taken off the table. Countries like Lithuania, located in the Baltic region of Europe, have continued their efforts for recruitment with a conscription list of 27,000 men. Being much closer to the ongoing battle, it makes sense that the small nation would continue to raise their numbers, but they've announced that they currently have no interest in making this model universal. In 2004, Italy's force became a professional all-volunteer system, but this can possibly change. According to various sources, rumors of a possible reinstatement of compulsory military service have been around for a long time. Matteo Salvini has spoken about compulsory military service on several occasions, saying, "I believe that a year of teaching the rules, good manners, and duties would make good citizens." And as its interior minister, he says he was studying the costs, ways, and times to evaluate if, how, and when to reintroduce military service for a few months for our boys and girls so that they can at least learn some education that mom and dad are not able to teach them. Unlike the last two countries we've listed, the motives for Italian conscription don't seem to revolve around a Russian threat. To some, it just seems like a way to improve domestic concerns. The issue with analyzing Italy is that it isn't known for its governmental consistency. In fact, since World War II, the governing body has changed 68 times. There's no way to know what'll come next. A bit closer to the current fighting front, according to recent reports, Romania is looking like another draft supporter. Figures like Angel Tilvar, the country's defense minister, have recently announced that he's interested in expanding the military. Bordering Ukraine, it makes sense that there would be a call for increased militarization. After all, if push comes to shove, they would find themselves on the front line of NATO and EU defense policy, geographically close to the war in Ukraine and reported instability in Moldova. Further aside, Romania will have a hard time recruiting due to its economic position. The current salary for a Romanian non-commissioned officer, such as sergeant or corporal, is between 459 and 994 euros per month. Because of this, conscription is looking like a pretty attractive option. When the July 2022 Black Sea grain initiative between Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations collapsed last year, Ukraine sought to reroute much of its grain shipments through the Danube River. When the Russians discovered this, they launched a series of drone strikes near the delta. Some of these explosions reportedly occurred on Romanian soil. If things escalate, this course of action seems inevitable, not to mention, relations with other neighbors are equally unstable. As violence and unrest break out in the Balkans, Serbia appears to be making moves of its own. Serbian nationalists continue to apply pressure on their government, hoping that the outcry will result in serious action. But there are those who aren't in favor of these ideas. Opposition politicians and other critics of the draft have questioned the logic of a military buildup when Serbia is almost completely surrounded by NATO member countries that have superior firepower in case of a conflict. On the face of it, that seems like a pretty logical argument, but Serbia's close ties with Russia, in conjunction with a refusal to introduce sanctions, have placed figures like popular President Aleksandar Vučić in a delicate position. He himself has publicly promoted the idea of conscription amidst these developments. Even Germany, albeit more temperate today, has considered reintroducing some old customs. Like Italy, there are those who feel the decision would have a societal benefit. Citing attacks on firefighters and police officers, Brice Pistorius, Germany's federal minister of defense, told Süddeutsche Zeitung, "It appears that the people have lost the awareness that they themselves are part of the state and of society. Taking responsibility for a set period could open eyes and ears for that. However, there's also an interest in bumping up unit numbers in general. A number of political leaders are complaining about a lack of troops in the Bundeswehr, the armed forces of the Federal Republic of Germany. As Russia continues to move into the West, this proposition has become a serious possibility. In France, President Emmanuel Macron is working on bringing mandatory national service back to the country. The administration hopes that the new program will help new citizens bond with the old, eventually building a national identity that has been fading in recent years. Surprisingly, much of France has shared support for the idea. A YouGov poll in February 2018 showed that 60% of French people favored a compulsory national service of between 3 and 6 months. This might come as a shock to outsiders, considering France hasn't presented itself as an advocate for martial improvements since the Second World War. Many of the previously mentioned states are looking at the Norwegian model for guidance. Since 2015, the nation has proudly stood as the first European country to have compulsory military service for both sexes, and female involvement continues to rise. In 2020 alone, 33% of people who completed the initial compulsory military service were women. However, only a small percentage goes on to seek a career with the armed forces. This might change in light of recent events, but Norway has used this tradition to help young people transition into full-on adulthood. It's a model that many on the continent admire, as it may solve the decline in voluntary service in their own respective systems. The most recent and perhaps most surprising supporter of conscription is Sweden. This is an odd change of pace, considering that the nation-state has had a relatively hard stance on neutrality since King Gustav XIV's proclamation in 1834. Nevertheless, Sweden's NATO application spurred a renewed interest in modern militarization. With growing issues such as the Russian threat, Sweden's political landscape is changing dramatically. Conscription is up 30% this year, and the armed forces budget is up by 28%. giving them another $2.5 billion to use to bolster their defenses. Officials are quick to point out the country's new draft system is highly selective. Out of the nearly 100,000 Swedes who turned 18 this year, recruiters only picked 4,000 men and women to serve. As is the case with France, there's little resistance to the prospect among young adults, who seem to be in favor of having a sense of direction. In theory, there seems to be a lot of positives that come with giving a uniform to those without direction. But as much as mandatory service appears harmless on its own, as history has shown, it's also quite provocative. There are a number of issues that come up when reintroducing these recruitment mechanisms: public unrest, economic burden, lack of veteran aid, and other complexities can make the decision more costly than it is beneficial. Chief amongst them, however, would probably be related to the patterns observed earlier in this video. No matter how you look at the progression, Europe has always followed the same trend. Even during the time of levies and slavery, pushing one's populace into service more often than not starts a chain reaction. Take Romania and Serbia, for example. Reports state that the Romanian president's decision to push conscription followed a recent announcement by Serbia's military to do the same, where the defense minister in Belgrade has been pushing for a return of mandatory military service. If these policies are approved, which they most likely will be, the two countries will continue to double down. This move, joined with a scarcity of resources, can make the prospect of war all the more tantalizing, considering what the spoils can do for your people. Not only this, but Serbia's continual support for Russia puts them in a position many countries have held in the past, one that just might call on them to fulfill a fatal bargain. Building a formidable army not only threatens those next to you, but it also makes you a prime candidate for future involvement. National defense is something every country requires, but it puts you in the line of fire if done incorrectly. As far as predictions go, nothing can really be said beyond pure speculation. Most governments in Europe are fearful of publicly initiating compulsory service, as removing progressive policy is an incredibly difficult task. We see that countries like the UK are adamantly opposed to the idea of conscription. However, given all the available data, it doesn't look like the continent will have much of a choice if these states wish to hold on to their national identity, and that's the common theme found in every segment of the European timeline. Now check out US Congressman warns of new Russian doomsday weapon, or watch this video instead.